It would be a long but urgent journey, and this would be the only chance for Flozan and Richard to talk alone. It was clear that the cleric had something to tell him. Along with the carriage were 2 coachmen, but both would return to Faust as soon as they arrived at Mockoffport. The interiors were plain but sophisticated, its base color a light gold similar to that of the church. Richard felt a sense of majesty as he stepped foot on the carriage, as if he was in the Church of the Eternal Dragon itself. Flozan was seated opposite him, looking about the same age as himself. The girl had long, light gold hair and eyebrows, the color making the brows barely visible if one didn't look close. However, that gave the already beautiful lady an air of mystery vaguely reminiscent of the ruins at the center of the Church of the Eternal Dragon. There were complicated vein lines between her brows, with it being another mystery whether that was the effect of certain divine spells or she was just born that way. I am Flozan, level 8 cleric of the Church of the Eternal Dragon. Flozan introduced herself the moment Richard got on. Ignore the unusual name, it was something Teacher Ferlin gave me. I do not know what my true name is, I was abandoned before the entrance of the church when I was still an infant. Outside of the more common divine spells, I specialize in the divine spells of the Eternal Dragon. This is my weapon, the Book of Time. Flozan took out a thick, gold leather book, showing it to Richard before she took out a map and revealed it to the boy. It was a hand-drawn map of Mockoffport and the surrounding sea area, detailing the hundreds of islands scattered nearby. Flozan pointed to one of the further islands and said, I know Marquis Gatton set up a military base for you in the plane we're going to, but he's yet to pick a teleportation point. Teacher Ferlin chose this place for us, no one knows about it as of now. This island has enough plains, forests, and essential deepwater ports. The continent isn't far away, and it's especially close to Mockoffport and Port Rose of the Archerons, so we can set up the portal there. Richard nodded, making a mental note of the position of the island. Flozan then stowed the map away, passing Richard an emerald gem before saying, This life crystal will be able to stabilize the seed for a while, so you won't have to carry it everywhere. You can just leave it in this carriage during our journey. The girl didn't speak further after Richard stowed the crystal away, closing her eyes. All signs of life seemed to dissipate the moment her eyelids closed completely, leaving Richard unable to feel her aura at all. It was like she'd disappeared into thin air. This shocked him beyond words. He opened his own eyes again, seeing the girl sitting there deathly still. It wasn't that she had no aura, no, she'd already become one with the archaic aura within the carriage. It seemed like Flozan had her own unique way of meditation and practice, and Richard didn't want to disturb her. He took out a book himself, reading it to pass the time. The journey was long, but the inside and outside of the carriage were worlds apart. He felt almost no jolts, and could hear nothing from the outside world. Richard took his time with the book, even repeating a few pages. He was so focused on reading that he didn't even realize when Flozan woke up to observe him silently. You're studying history? Flozan asked out of the blue, seeming a little surprised. Richard raised his head as he answered, closing the book and passing it over. He was particularly willing to interact with Flozan, since she would be an important companion in the dangerous planar wars. Trust and chemistry between comrades was a factor that could decide life and death on the battlefield. Flozan received the book without any hesitation and asked, You're interested in the history of the Silvermoon Elves? They are the descendants of the ancient Elven Empire, but today there are only a handful of tribes left on Norland. With your father's assault on Evernight Forest, there aren't any big groups left in human territory, a mere few tribes scattered here and there. If you're interested in the elves and elven culture, you should visit the Evergreen Continent. It lies to the west of Norland, across the vast oceans. The continent is still ruled by an elven monarch. Or you could come to the church once we return from the plains and look through some art pieces Teacher Ferlin collected from the time of the Elven Empire. Richard gave her a simple smile. My primary interest is in the attack Marquis Gatton led on Silvermoon Palace. It's a classic example of a major victory with a numeric disadvantage. But I realized there's rather few records about it, so I can only read up more and learn about it indirectly. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 108. Journey. Flozen nodded her head, apparently not finding it strange that Richard didn't just ask his father about the events of that day. She spoke naturally, as if this was a common topic. Indeed, there are few records on that battle. Marquis Gatton suffered a severe injury in the final moments of that war, but his vice-commander had already finished surrounding the remaining Silvermoon elves. The elven royalty would never surrender, so there were no royal prisoners from that war. The only elves they managed to bring back were peasants, which became slaves of the imperial family. Marquis Gatton himself never publicized the results of his campaign, so there wasn't much recorded about it. Furthermore, if I were to speak the truth, not many people like the Arcarans, so they naturally wouldn't want to chronicle their feats. So that's what happened. Thank you, Flozen, Richard said in earnest. However, now done with her explanation, Flozen continued to speak. If you have the time to browse through history, I suggest you take the time to read the notebooks teacher Ferlin gave you. They contain information about the myriad planes, as well as the teachings of the eternal dragon. It will benefit our expedition. If you don't have any interest in that, from what I've heard you are an amazing runemaster. Think of the battles we will face, and decide on a rune befitting of me. When we arrive safely in the new plane, you can make a set of runes for me. Runes? Richard was rather surprised. He looked between Flosan's brows. Isn't that a special rune on your forehead? If I guess correctly, this rune contains some form of powerful ability, does it not? It should be grade 4. But I only have one rune on my body right now, the cleric countered. A grade 4 rune isn't enough? Richard laughed hoarsely, but when he saw Flosan's solemn look, he withdrew his smile. He instead pondered in shock for a while, before asking, "You can withstand more runes?" Flosan nodded her head. A grade 4 rune required 10 times the carrying capacity of an elementary rune. Richard was already surprised that Flozen could bear one. After all, anyone that could even withstand a grade 3 rune below level 10 deserved to be proud of themselves. He'd never have thought that Flozen could actually bear even more. If that's the case, I'll have to offend you for a moment. It's no offense. Don't tarry. If you can craft a rune for me, I will allow you to inscribe it on my body. Richard was rather stupefied. The chest was the most likely location on one's body to place a rune. Of course, inscribing a rune directly was much better than using an attachment slot, reducing the capacity requirements and allowing more efficient energy transfer, but the tolerance for modifications was also low at 5% and it would be extremely difficult to change runes in the future. The process of removing a tattooed rune was excruciatingly painful, and with the failure rate of the normal runemaster, most knights wouldn't even consider direct inscription if it wasn't a high-grade rune. However, since Flozen said that she did not mind, Richard would no longer dwell on this matter. But when he cast the detection spell, he received yet another shock. Flosan's arms and legs, as well as her chest and stomach, all responded with powerful energy waves. Richard immediately realized that she still had the capacity left to withstand another, albeit weaker, grade 4 rune. This toppled his knowledge on the world of runecrafting. There were two things that influenced the runic power of a rune knight. One was their carrying capacity, while the other was the number of possible positions on their bodies to attach runes to. More positions with the same capacity would be able to fit in more runes. Although a grade 4 rune took up 10 times that capacity of an elementary one, a rune knight with 10 elementary runes would easily defeat one with a single grade 4 rune. Many rune knights, including several powerful figures on the continent, were often troubled by the lack of rune positions at higher levels. For example, the illustrious divine set of St. Peter required at least 5 slots, and one needed enough capacity on top of that. Richard himself only had 2. But Flozen showed a whopping 6 options to choose from. How is it? Flozen asked. Richard rubbed his temples and smiled wryly. this exceeds my expectations. I'll need some time to think. That's no problem. We have enough time, so have at it. Done with what she wanted to say, Flozin closed her eyes once more. After a more than 10-hour non-stop journey, the party finally reached Giantwood Village. This was an unassuming town under Earl Goliath's governance. It was located in a remote area, in the midst of mountains and endless forests. The only specialty of Giantwood Village was their wood, but due to difficulty in transportation that didn't bring much economic benefit to the villagers. Since there was no trade to speak of, there were very few visitors as well. From any angle, Giantwood Village was an ordinary, poor, and quiet village. There were only 100 or so families here, and their lives had not changed in many years. In the depths of the forest behind this village lay the death training camp of the Arcarans. This camp was over 100 years old, having groomed countless assassins, curse masters, and warriors in its time. This was a place free of race and class. Every individual that entered was trained, and the only task they were given was to survive. To survive until their training came to an end. Most of the participants of this death training camp were orphans, death row criminals, and slaves. There were also psychopaths and fanatics here, those who found joy in the act of killing. There were also a significant number of Arcarans, in order to pursue greater power and strength, that were willing to volunteer and enter this camp. However, all participants were treated equally. In the face of death, an Arcaran and orphan had no difference in status. If they wanted to live, they could only rely on their brains or bronze, or perhaps both. Of course, Richard was not here to receive training, but to choose a soul guard. This was one of the resources that the family would provide for promising talents. The soul guard would be bound by a soul contract that tied their soul to Richard's. Any thoughts of betrayal would wipe out their very soul, and they also served to assist Richard in resisting soul attacks. Of course, the reverse was not true. A soul attack directed at the soul guard would not affect Richard at all. Under the power of the contract, the soul guard and their master would have their destinies intertwined, making for the most loyal of guardians. However, such contracts were extremely rare, with most coming from the blessings of the eternal dragon. Legendary clerics and priests could create them as well, but making even one required a large amount of divine power and a small portion of one's very soul. A new legendary cleric would drop out of the legendary realm with just two, so few would be willing to do such a thing. As for the contracts coming from the eternal dragon, there was a factor of chance involved. Only those who were extremely lucky would be able to obtain such a thing. Richard took out his soul-binding contract when they arrived at their destination, causing Flozin to blink her eyes several times in surprise. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 109. Death Camp. Most of the party remained in Giantwood Village, at the village's only inn. In the company of Dragon Mage Lena and the village chief, Richard headed towards the death training camp. The Arcaran death training camp was located deep in the forest with a total of 7 different gathering points. The location closest to the village was at least 100 kilometers away, without any trail to follow. Even with the village chief as a guide, the 3 of them took over 3 hours to arrive at the camp. The ones being trained here were warriors and other classes who depended on physical strength. Passing a disorganized fence, Richard entered the camp. He saw several shabby huts within that made it seem like a small village, finding it difficult to believe that this was the famed death training camp of the Arcarans. Only when the instructor here, Schiller, was stood in front of him did he confirm that he was at the right place. Schiller was a man of average build, with short, grassy hair that was a complete mess. There was no magic armor on him, only a saber that was hung at his waist. The weapon's scabbard was plain and dirty, but the man's clothes were clean. Outside of that, there was nothing special in his appearance. However, for some reason Richard felt like he was being pricked by a needle as he looked at the man standing before him, even having to squint his eyes a little. His eyes soured very quickly, almost tearing up. Just as the tears were about to flow, a gentle magic enveloped his entire body and soothed that needle-like sensation. Lena chided Schiller in an icy voice. "Schiller, what are you trying to do? Are you tired of living?" Schiller smiled like nothing had happened and his expression was relaxed. He spoke in a casual manner, "Nothing much. I just wanted to see what the young master who's about to take away my best warrior is like. Young Master Richard has a great appearance." Lena snorted icily a couple of times. "What does the young master's strength have to do with you? Do you really think that this death training camp belongs to you? You're just this place's manager. Have you been here so long that your brain rotted away?" Her rebuke was harsh and direct, not giving the man any face. A black aura coiled around Schiller's face. Although he maintained his smile, it seemed like the calm before the storm. "This is Earl Goliath's land. And Lena, I don't recall you being my match." There was an extremely explosive atmosphere in the air. Richard watched the two bicker on with an indifferent expression, but an almost undetectable light started to glow under his robes. He prepared a curse already, but he wasn't sure how useful it would be in a battle between the two. Suddenly, Lena chuckled coquettishly. "I am just a mage, how could I be a match for a shadow guard like yourself? Why don't I change places with someone else? Who do you want? You definitely wouldn't dare fight Mordred, so how about Bifang or Osiris? Or the two tanks, Kalen and Cade? Maybe you want all of us to come at you together." Schiller snorted, and his expression turned even darker. He had wanted to say more, but eventually decided to suppress it. Gatton's 13 knights were not the strongest individually, but they were extremely united when facing an enemy. Even if more than half of Gatton's rune knights were not Schiller's match, any two of them would be able to beat him up easily. Lena's haughtiness had yet another meaning contained within. Many of the 13 knights were generals who were able to lead the troops, and their status was different from Schiller. She had no need to fight the Shadow Guard one-on-one to know who was better. Lena suddenly withdrew all of her arrogance, and said solemnly, "Schiller, I'm telling you this because of Earl Goliath. I sincerely urge you to stop all your tricks. Every important Archaron outside of Marquis Sauron has agreed about young Master Richard. If you delay his plans, the first one to come for your throat will likely be Earl Goliath himself." Schiller's eyes flashed as he stared intently at Lena. The dragon mage was calm and collected, however, looking him straight in the eye. He eventually had to turn his head and look at Richard, before speaking in a deep voice. "All right then, young Master Richard, please follow me. I hope you will be able to find a suitable candidate. Let me first give you a tour of our small camp, for you to better understand the environment our brave warriors have been living in." Richard walked into the largest hut under Schiller's guidance, frowning immediately at the sharp smell that assaulted his nostrils. The hut was big, but with 30 people crammed into there was very little free space. There was no bed in the room, only mattresses laid onto the floor spread apart to allow one to walk through the middle. Several large brutes, stark naked, were laid on the floor in a disorganized manner. Their barbaric, unruly aura could not be concealed. Inside the wooden hut, several brutes were wildly fucking a woman. The woman was just as muscled as them, and seemed to be a participant of the camp. However, she wasn't strong enough to avoid being a toy of these savages. Another woman was wrestling a large man in a contained space. The result of a loss went without saying. Seeing Richard and company walk in, especially the voluptuous Lena, the brutes lying on the ground stood up immediately, their eyes blazing with fervent passion. Lena did not get angry. She instead pouted her lips, sending them a flying kiss. This was adding fuel to the fire, and the clamoring noises grew much louder as more than half the people here had already stood up. However, while their eyes were spewing flames, their bodies remained clenched and on standby. No matter what, these two coming here at this time was extremely bizarre. Once Schiller entered as well, all of them turned solemn. Those men with killing intent retreated as well. Richard stood unmoving by the door, and his gaze swept past the room. He suddenly spoke, there's no need to look any longer. Before even waiting for Lena or Schiller to reply, he turned around and walked out. After exiting the hut, Richard walked to the center of the campgrounds and looked up at the night sky, not saying a thing. There was indeed no need to look any longer. These brutes in the hut were level 7 or 8 warriors. Furthermore, in such an environment, he did not discover any extraordinary talent. Even just taking them to another plane would be a waste of resources, forget using a soul contract on them. The fifth moon hung in the night sky, its light purplish moonlight representing Alucia's divine wrath. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 110. Death Camp. Lena followed Richard out of the wooden hut, standing beside him with a trace of a mysterious smile on her face. She crossed her arms, looking at Schiller as if she was waiting for a scene to play out. Schiller walked out as well, although his face had grown somewhat unsightly. Lena was about to speak, but was stopped with a wave of Richard's arms. He didn't look at Schiller at all, instead staring up at the purple moon that hung in the skies. He said indifferently, "This is the night of the purple moon, Mr. Schiller. Do you know what it represents?" Schiller growled, "I am just a brute." "It represents Alucia's wrath," Richard explained pleasantly. Schiller's expression froze for a moment. "I'm just a brute. I don't understand what young master is trying to say. Is this Alucia you're speaking of, a beauty?" Richard responded with a question of his own. "What is this place?" "The Archeron's death training camp," Schiller replied. Richard looked at the moon and asked softly, "Mr. Schiller, I still don't know your surname." "Toller," Schiller replied, but his expression somewhat changed. "What is the relationship between the Archerons and Tollers?" Richard pressed on. "There is none." Schiller seemed to understand Richard's intentions, and his face turned extremely dark. It actually looked like tears were about to fall. "So, what level are you at right now?" Schiller paused for a moment before saying, "Level 19, Shadow Guard." Only then did Richard turn around to look Schiller in the eye, his voice turning icy, "Neither an Archeron nor a legendary being. I don't understand on what basis you assume that the people in this camp are your private property." Schiller's pupils constricted, and a murderous aura poured out of his body. This outright reproach left him unable to repress his killing intent. He was the one who'd brought this camp to its current level of power, his greatest achievement in the family. However, it was only in the past few years that the family had shown any interest in him. It was understandable why his actions were completely different from his pleasant words. The relationships between the Archerons weren't too good, and those with equal levels of bloodline had great rivalry between them. Earl Goliath and Marquis Gatton, for example, were basically enemies. This death training camp was built in Goliath's territory, so of course it was controlled by the Earl. Schiller was thus one of Goliath's men. Schiller wanted to retort, but his expression suddenly changed as a tiny golden scroll revealed itself in Richard's hands. He recognized this item. It was a soul contract. Just the presence of this scroll was several times more effective in confirming Richard's authority than Lena herself. The blessings of the Eternal Dragon were based on a factor of luck, but to get the soul contract meant one definitely had to offer a sacrifice that satisfied the Eternal Dragon. This scroll was equivalent to a 30-year boost to one's life. Richard casually tossed this priceless item to Schiller's hands and spoke icily, "I'm sure you know what this item is. I'm not here to play around, and my current mission cannot be changed by someone like you. I give you two choices: show me someone worthy of this scroll, or we leave." The scroll flashed a golden light, revealing a faint aura of time that allowed Schiller to confirm its authenticity. However, that put Schiller in a bad spot. This piece of paper now seemed as heavy as a mountain. Just like Richard had said, nobody would bring out a soul contract if they were playing around. Not even the Sacred Alliance Emperor, bloodthirsty Philip, would do so. One of the resources the Archerons gave their core members was a personal bodyguard, trained at the death camp. However, the strength of that bodyguard was determined by the camp's manager, and normally nobody would press the issue even if someone was assigned a weakling. Since this camp was in Earl Goliath's territory, it was only natural that Gatton's son would be given a poor guard. However, there was a huge difference between a regular bodyguard and a soul guard. The moment Richard took out the soul contract, Schiller was left with no room whatsoever to maneuver in. If he sent the boy back empty-handed, he was sure that Gatton's knights would come looking to kill him. Mordred or Osiris would definitely be overseeing the attack, so there would be no chance of escape. The best end would be being killed on the spot. Schiller had never expected Richard's attitude to be this unyielding, causing this stalemate in the situation. In fact, once Gatton had successfully entered Faust, the relationship between him and his brother had mellowed. They had even begun to explore some avenues of cooperation, giving Richard a soul guard being an important one. But despite this change in circumstances, Schiller still treated Richard and Lena in such an unbecoming manner. Whether it was that he was being obstinate or that he wasn't up to date on the information, only he knew. The original missive Schiller had been given was to do his best to make things difficult for Richard, but not to hide the participants from him. He still had to show Richard the best talents in his camp. This was a contradictory command, but it worked well to sum up the relationship between Gatton and Goliath. Schiller's expression wavered, but Richard did not press on. He instead looked up at the purple moon, something that only caused the invisible pressure to grow. Schiller finally made up his mind and returned the scroll to Richard, before easing his tone and saying, "I understand your request. Please follow me, it's already growing late, and we still have a ways to go." Schiller got on a horse, taking Richard and Lena through the forest. It took another 100 kilometers for them to reach a stream at the foothills of a mountain. There were 2 rows of disorderly wooden huts here, along with several caves that led deep into the mountain. Schiller pointed ahead, "This is the true death camp. The most talented warriors of the family all walk out of here. Right now, there are 3 people who are above level 10. I'll call them back right away." Richard nodded his head, and Schiller took out a metal whistle. He blew hard on it, and a shrill ear-piercing screech traveled throughout the area, causing a nearby flock of birds to fly away in fright. Several of the wooden huts opened up, young men and women of various appearances walking out. The one commonality between them all was their wolf-like eyes. Richard's gaze swept past every participant present. Suddenly, the door of the wooden hut at the highest point of the stream was blasted open, as if the hut was going to collapse. A large brute walked out, almost completely naked except for some beastskin wrapped around his waist. He was extremely tall and sturdy, his chiseled muscles looking as hard as steel. The tiny wooden hut seemed barely able to hold his large body within, and he'd had to bend down to step through the door. The large bloke walked out, and exclaimed, "Oh ho! Boss, you brought new prey again? If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 111. Soul Guard. Schiller spoke bluntly, "No, we are here to choose. Tonight, one lucky fellow will be chosen to be a soul guard. You get to show off your killing prowess in another plane." The big fellow's eyes flashed like lightning, his gaze sweeping past Lena as his pupils constricted. He then looked over Richard, immediately picking up a poorly crafted 2-handed axe and waving it several times in the air. "Hey!" he roared, "Young master, pick me. Look, my axe can't handle the hunger anymore." In the face of such a fervent request, Richard could only smile wryly. Schiller pointed at the man. "This is Gangder, 21 years old. He's a level 10 warrior with the bloodline of giants, having awakened Gaia's force. When it's activated, it greatly increases his strength and defense. He's one of the best candidates." Several people emerged from the caves of the mountain. Schiller pointed to another skinny youth, saying, "This is Kerf, a level 10 assassin at 19 years of age. He has a mixed bloodline of humans and dark elves, his ability being stealth. He's also a good one. Finally, Schiller fingers pointed towards a woman with a cold and detached expression. Diffie of the Camires, descendant of the Highland wizards with powerful innate talent for magic. She is a natural-born warlock, possessing great firepower at any moment. Her bloodline ability is a magic boost as well. She's the last candidate I want to introduce. The Arcaran Death Camp only trained its participants up to level 10. Their talents and abilities would have awakened by then, so their future growth would depend on battle results. All three of the candidates Schiller had picked were obviously much stronger than the other participants. They were extremely suitable for Richard's requirements. The plane he was traveling to didn't have a permanent portal yet, so level 10 was the limit of the portal. Anyone above that boundary would likely affect the spacetime tunnel with their overwhelming power, being tossed into the currents of spacetime. Even a legendary being would not want to be caught in such a chaotic current. Richard raised his hands and began a chant, but Lena was one step faster. She cast a group detection spell, avoiding having to cast one on every individual. Richard vividly detected the magic response from each of them, confirming their rune capacity. With the standard requirement of an elementary rune at 10 points, Kerf had a total 43 points of capacity, Diffie 41, and Gangder a tremendous 72. This fellow with his thirsty axe could actually withstand a total of 4 runes, and one of them could even be grade 3 as long as it was on the weaker end. If they were willing to spend several millions on him, he would immediately turn into a rune knight. Gangder sensed Richard's gaze on him changing, so he bellowed even more loudly before. But this time, it was towards the other candidates. "Hey, you useless maggots. Did you see that? The young master wants me. Me, Gangder. Whoever is not happy can come forward, and we can battle. Let me show you how to use wits in a fight. Come, anyone? My axe can't handle the hunger anymore." Nobody moved, not even Kerf or Diffie. Gangder's roar seemed to intimidate everyone else, and their behavior indicated that he'd regularly beaten them in fights before. Richard was rather satisfied with this brute. He was already level 10 at 21 years of age, so it wouldn't be a problem for him to reach level 14 or 15 in the future. Even if he didn't improve from there, his high carry capacity would allow him to become a high-ranking rune knight. He would hold an important position in Richard's team in the future. However, Richard continued to think deeply, unable to make up his mind. Gangder was an exemplary candidate, but it seemed unfitting to use a soul contract on him. A good warrior was different from a good bodyguard, and Gangder's talent didn't awe Richard all that much. Having lived in the deep blue for a long time, Richard's appetite had already grown. Noticing that several huts were still empty, Richard asked Schiller about it. That was when he learnt that some of the participants were still out in the forest, hunting. They hadn't been able to make it back in time because of the distance, but the man said it wasn't a problem since the promising candidates were already before Richard. There was no need to wait for any other people. Just then, an ear-piercing scream split the skies above the forest, followed by the sounds of twigs and branches snapping. A bloodied man dashed out into the open in a flash, jumping into the stream and flailing in the water as he tried to swim away as fast as possible. The stream was rather deep, with fast-flowing currents and jagged reefs at the bottom. In his panic to run away, the man seemed to be severely injured. In a few moments, the fresh blood had already dyed the stream a faint pink. Level 11 warrior, no special abilities. This fellow was just prey for the death camp's participants, Lena whispered lightly into Richard's ears. There were magic beasts amongst the prey for the death camp, but there were many humans as well. Many warriors of different race and class were placed in the forest, and the participants were tasked with hunting down and killing them before they escaped. Their prey was normally higher level than the participants, with those awarding the most marks being level 14 or 15. The hunt was thus a perilous one, with plenty of cases where the predator became the prey. Richard gazed at the edges of the forest, having the unknown feeling that the hunter would give him a surprise. A rather scrawny white figure emerged silently from the forest. It was a young girl in a tattered white dress, her clothes torn so badly that they could only be called rags. She had no defenses to speak of, and the clothes didn't even cover her entire body. If not for cloths wrapped around her chest and waist, she would be essentially naked. She was standing on top of a branch, her long fair legs contrasting the gloomy backdrop of the forest. The sight of her bare feet gripping the branch was somewhat eye-catching. Every single one of her digits could be seen clearly. She had wild, shaggy hair that she seemed to have cut short herself. The silhouette of her face seemed rather beautiful, but the deep green eyes flashed like a hunter looking at their prey. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 112. Soul Guard. The branches she was resting on were very delicate, making it hard to believe that they could even hold her weight. The branches were swaying even in the wind, but abruptly they sunk downwards under her force. Just before they crossed the breaking point, they were relieved of her weight, and by the time they even returned to position, she'd catapulted away at the speed of lightning. Even just a jump left Richard gasping in awe. He'd learnt the techniques of the underworld himself, so he could recognize the profound control of strength behind that leap. Breaking a branch might seem like a small matter, but it would leave behind traces that were impossible to erase. A brilliant hunter could use such traces to track their prey. Even with her target right in front of her, the girl didn't slack off in the slightest, leaving no tracks behind. If her actions were not because of prior training to take care of such detail, she had to have a natural disposition as an assassin. The girl hugged the ground stealthily, reducing the distance between her and her prey at an unfathomable speed. She shot forth like a rocket every time her feet touched the granite rock, moving a few meters in a near instant. From a distance she just looked like a white apparition moving across the riverbank. The injured prey had made his way across the stream with great difficulty. His steps were unsteady, and he eventually landed flat onto the ground. Injured in having to travel across the ice-cold water in the stream, he was obviously only seconds from falling apart. He struggled to crawl back up, but he fell down again pretty quickly, before eventually getting himself up and fleeing the scene in haste. This fellow is pretending, biding time for a final attack. It seems like he wants to take her down with him, Lena commented. Even though she'd only recently become a grand mage herself, her intuition and combat experience were not something Richard could quantify. Lena could sense that Richard had grown interested in that hunter, so she added more information to help his judgment. The youth sped up, leaning forward so much now that her hands almost touched the ground. She instantly charged through the riverbank, before going on all fours and leaping up like a ferocious beast. She left a blur of white in the air, using both hands to steady herself on the emerging rocks that dotted the surface of the stream as she shot from rock to rock. To Richard, it was like a cunning winter wolf was chasing after her prey with all her might. She crossed the 10 meters of the stream effortlessly, catching up with her target. Despite her great speed, she didn't seem to give out a single sound in the process. On the other hand, the injured man had accurately predicted her exact position. He decided to give up the facade in that instant, turning around quickly as he pounced at her with a roar. Given the builds of the two, one could easily tell that his strength far exceeded hers, giving him the advantage in close-quarters combat. However, the teenage girl did not have any idea of escaping, and she too prowled towards the man. Just as the two seemed about to collide, the girl jumped faster and higher than the man. She changed her position mid-air, avoiding the collision as she stepped on the man's body. Using him as a pivot, she somersaulted forward, placing herself behind him. And then, with what seemed like a mysterious hand supporting her, she mysteriously changed direction to land on the man's back with a thud. Time seemed to have stopped at this very moment, as the teenage girl held the prey in a chokehold with her right hand. Her left hand had suddenly conjured a black steel weapon. Thus, under Richard's careful attention, the iron rod in the girl's hand viciously moved towards the man's hips. It sent shivers down Richard's spine, so much so that he subconsciously clutched his glutes. Thankfully for him, many others reacted in the same way, Lena included. The man abruptly let out a pathetic squeal, his body tensing up as he was fiercely catapulted to the ground. The girl flicked her wrist, burying the rod in the man's behind before she harshly removed it, leaving behind a spray of fresh blood. She followed that up by rolling away from the prey, giving no chance for the man who was making a futile effort to survive. She instead steadied herself on the floor like a wolf, glancing at all the students in the wooden huts and on the cliff with the threat evident in her eyes. Kerf, the one with the drow bloodline, moved towards her, but seeing her with no heavy injuries nor any signs of fatigue, he waved it away and retreated to his original position. As for the other students, many largely avoided the teenage girl's vicious glance. No one came forth to fight for the prey, and the man eventually lost any signs of struggle as he began to twitch on the ground. Having observed the scenario, the teenager then decided to walk to the prey, before she used a sharp blade of the steel weapon to slit the prey's throat, ending his suffering. Afterwards she probed around the prey's chest, and retrieved an engraved silver placard. She broke the chains of the placard, took it in hand, walking towards Schiller. The girl stopped only a few meters away from Schiller, not daring to get too close to him. Her body tensed up, evidently showing that she was in a very defensive state. The anxiety she showed at this juncture proved to be more intense than when she was facing the others of the training camp. A dull thud rang out as she threw the placard in Schiller's direction, announcing in a rigid voice, "Placard, this month." Schiller nodded his head. "This is your third placard in this month." "That's great. I'll get someone to send you your items tomorrow." Lena explained the situation with a whisper. It seemed like the death camp added prey to the training every once in a while, giving all the prey placards. The students had to kill such prey every month, being rewarded with medals and reimbursement for their effort. The reimbursements included things such as equipment, resources, as well as potions that would enhance one's physique. Of all the rewards, the potion was the most sought after as they would enhance the members' fighting physique. And the students all had placards that would certify their identity. Should they be mistaken for prey, they could merely produce their placards to prove their identity to seek freedom. This would be much safer than simply running away. As for the students who did not manage to fulfill their quotas every month, they would receive punishments in the first 3 months. The punishments included beatings of varying intensities, and were administered independent of gender. The 4th time the students failed to complete their quota, they would be rendered the same status as the prey. After the teenage girl threw the placard to Schiller, she shot a glance at Lena before slowly retreating. She was still very much guarded, and refused to leave her back facing any of them. Just at this juncture, a ray suddenly shone onto her body. The teenage girl watched the debris behind her fly into the air in shock. A thud ensued almost instantly as she went prone, stealthily arming herself with the weapon that still had fresh blood on it. She leveled a deathly gaze onto Richard. Lena took a step forward and shielded Richard, as she wielded the magical staff in her hands. With regards to the teenage girl's vicious aura, Lena appeared to have certain reservations. The dragon mage was also taken aback by the fact that this teenage girl would threaten even herself, as the teenage girl's strength was not particularly outstanding. As for the ray of light shining on the teenage girl, it was a testing spell, just like what Lena had previously released. A typical mage only obtained conventional feedback about the target's strength, magic powers, and bloodline, but with precision Richard was amongst the esteemed ones who could tell a target's capacity from the magic waves alone. It was not something even many true rune masters could manage. Fearful of Lena and Schiller's formidable strength, and not feeling like she had been hurt, the teenage girl's killing aura slowly dissipated, as she retreated once more. "Hold up!" Richard suddenly called to the teenage girl. He then pointed to her as he declared to Schiller, "I want her." Schiller's brows furrowed. This is Waterflower, somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. She's currently a level 9 assassin, with an acute sense of smell for danger. She also has outstanding talent at combat, but she's not your best choice. The other 3 are all level 10 already, and unlike her they've actually awakened their bloodline abilities. Furthermore, she's very hard to tame. Richard looked up and down over the teenage girl, and stated, I have a soul contract, training her doesn't pose a problem at all. Also, why does she have such an uncommon name? Does she hail from any rare tribes? You don't seem sure of her age, either. Schiller hesitated, before explaining, I picked her up during one of my trips in the forest. She was living with a pack of moon wolves at that point, probably raised like a wolf cub. She looked about 5 years of age by normal standards, but even having learnt to speak she hasn't been able to explain exactly how long she'd lived with the wolf pack. That's why we don't know her definite age. As for her name, it was given to her by the other students in the training camp. They say that she's akin to an aquafloral fruit, tasty yet formidable with the protection of lethal poison. She's completely unattainable by the common person. Alright. She's the one I want. Richard had already made his decision. Lena could not help but raise her concerns. Richard, are you sure you don't want to reconsider your decision? Even though she is gifted in combat, she has not been able to showcase her bloodline abilities yet. That's a flaw that you will not be able to make up for. Furthermore, Schiller said that she was raised by a pack of wolves, so we will never be able to properly confirm her heritage. We can't be sure whether she even has any bloodline potential at all. We should err on the side of caution, and choose a more suitable option like Gangder. Lena's worries were not unfounded. Theoretically, both one's bloodline and their rune capacity were instrumental components of their battle might. In a battle between two rune knights of equal level, the one with the higher ranked ability would be able to completely suppress the other. Gatton had deliberately assigned Lena to Richard. It was done so that Richard could tap into her rich knowledge in the field of magic, aiding him in the selection of a befitting soul guard. Having said that, Lena eyed Waterflower's attractive figure once more. She started to think that Richard wanted to choose the girl for her appearance. After all, Waterflower's looks were extraordinary. The earlier scene also suggested that she had a formidable sixth sense on the battlefield, allowing her to compete with those with more innate abilities than her. However, to use a soul contract on her seemed a bit of a waste. Lena herself came from the upper class, possessing high expectations for class and elegance. Thus, she found Waterflower's tactics in attacking her prey's vitals quite distasteful. However, she wasn't surprised. A girl raised by wolves would naturally fight like one. The death camp itself focused on the opponent going down, not how that was accomplished. Having thought of this point, Lena immediately turned to look at Schiller. How many guys have bedded Waterflower? What the dragon mage was hinting at was very obvious. For a girl to hail from such a chaotic place, she would probably have had intimate relationships with many men. The sight they'd seen in the initial location was proof of that. However, Schiller's next words defied that rule. Right now, she's still pure. That's impossible. Lena immediately retorted. I picked her up myself. Before the age of 10, I did not allow anyone to touch her. And once she did reach that age, the other students of her batch haven't been able to grow intimate with her either. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 113. Contract. Lena frowned, not saying a word. This was not the time to jest. Schiller would not lie. Schiller looked at Richard and sighed. I am the one who adopted Waterflower. After all, she's like a daughter to me. Of course I'd want her to be chosen to leave this place. But I have to say, apart from the purity of her body, which will be valuable to you, she really isn't worthy of a soul contract. However, Richard had already taken out the contract. I scanned her just now. She can carry grade 4 runes, possibly even grade 5. It doesn't matter anymore whether she has bloodline abilities. Grade 5 runes? Lena and Schiller were both shocked. Even just grade 4 runes would allow her to become a 3rd grade rune knight. This was the power level of one of Gatton's knights, even if at the lower end. Indeed, such rune capacity would totally make up for a lack of bloodline abilities. Waterflower would be much more valuable than Gengar that way, worthy of a soul contract. However, Richard didn't mention all of his observations. Waterflower had a capacity as high as 153 points, far more than the 80 to 120 needed for a grade 4 rune. In this regard, even Flozen with her 180 points of capacity wasn't much better. On top of that, the magic had radiated from all over Waterflower's body. She had as many as 8 possible positions on her body, one more than Flozen's 7, but Daybreak Flozen was a cleric of the Church of the Eternal Dragon in Faust, one who could possibly take the position of the current High Priestess Ferlin in the future. She was a talent to be reckoned with. Waterflower was already a monster for having more rune positions than her. Waterflower, come here, Schiller waved the girl over. At this point, neither he nor Lena had any objections anymore. The young girl looked at the 3 people before her with caution, but from their conversation she was more or less aware of what was going to happen. She moved over hesitantly, her guard held high. This was something that she'd learned from beasts, to be extremely careful and alert when facing anyone or anything with great strength, regardless of their identity. Schiller glanced over at Waterflower with an inexplicable look in his eyes. You will be Master Richard's soul guard from today, and won't have to stay here anymore. You will be his second lifeline, someone who shares his destiny. Always act like how you did here, continuing to improve your power. And take this blade. It's been with me for years, I think it'll suit you. Schiller unlatched the meter-long war blade from his waist and tossed it to Waterflower. She caught it in an instant, moving back at the speed of lightning as she looked at the other members of the camp. She only drew out a portion of the blade once she was sure that nobody would ambush her. The weapon was less than 3 centimeters wide, with almost no reflections coming off the jet-black blade. It seemed inexplicably obscure, giving off an unnerving vibe as it left its sheath. Lena was a master in appraisal as well, and she exclaimed the moment she saw the blade being drawn, "Mythical Goldzan. This is the Shepherd of Eternal Rest." Richard was shocked by it too. This material was indeed superior to even alchemic black steel, one of the highest quality metals used to forge weapons. Weapons formed from it would be twice as strong as ordinary carbon steel weapons, also able to bear the power of 2 more enchantments. The sword Waterflower had in her hands was made by a great master, with the enchantments of bleed, tear, sharpen, and armor break added within. Its power was clear. Waterflower finally walked towards Richard under Schiller's urging, kneeling down upon Lena's orders. It was obvious from her expression and the cautious fiddling of her fingers that this proximity caused her great discomfort. It was possible she could hurt someone at any moment. With the Shepherd of Eternal Rest in her hands, and within such a small distance at that, even Lena felt uneasy. Lena ended up casting 2 calming spells on Waterflower, finally causing the wolf-like teenager to settle down a little. Richard slowly unfurled the soul contract in his hands, chanting the spell written upon it. In the name of eternity, I unite my soul with the person before my eyes. As the chant was read out, the contract started to emit a beam of golden light that grew brighter and brighter. It disintegrated piece by piece, becoming grains of sand scattered in the air to form a golden cloud of dust. Waterflower raised her head slightly, gazing curiously at the coagulated magical sand that seemed to have taken a part of her life. She felt no more fear, instead a faint anticipation. Her sharp intuition let her know that this was the moment her destiny was changed. The spell was complex and tedious, but finally all the golden grains of sand suddenly gathered into a stream of light. The light instantly shone onto Waterflower's forehead, condensing between her brows into an hourglass of light gold. It quickly turned upside down, its traces slowly disappearing into her body. Waterflower grew sluggish, fainting with a grunt while Richard felt like a portion of his soul had been extracted from his body in a split second, vanishing into the depths of space. A strong sense of weakness struck Richard's heart, and he couldn't help but stagger 2 steps back, leaning into a warm embrace. Lena had been well prepared, catching him before he fell. The dragon mage was fully aware of the consequences of soul contracts, so she took out 2 energy potions that she'd prepared beforehand. One she passed to Richard, while the other was fed to Waterflower. Richard felt his strength return slowly once he took the potion, growing a little better. He realized then that he could clearly tell Waterflower's exact location from just his mind, also being aware of the state of her mind. The girl slowly got up again. She bolted out of Lena's arms the moment she regained consciousness, unsheathing the sword and observing her surroundings warily. Richard could feel that she did not know why she'd lost consciousness, and was instinctively trying to identify unknown enemies. The youthful girl looked at Richard in surprise, as if she felt the effects of the soul contract as well. Richard sent her waves of comfort through their connection, having her calm down enough to sheath the sword again and steadily inch towards him. With the power of the contract acting on her, Richard's breath felt like the safest and most peaceful place in the world. Schiller let out a long sigh. You've already chosen a soul guard, it's time to leave this place. I hear that your schedule is quite tight. Richard nodded, turning his back to leave only to feel the earth suddenly shaking. A thunderous roar echoed from behind him. Hey there, young master. That Waterflower chick is pretty awesome, but Gangder isn't all that bad too. Now at least she's no match for me. Look, my axe can't handle the hunger anymore. See how rough and tough it is. It sure won't let you down. Richard stopped in his tracks, staring at the tough man who'd darted all the way here. Waterflower took a careful step forward, gripping tightly onto the shepherd of eternal rest. With this sword in hand, she wasn't afraid of him at all. Richard hesitated for a while, before he said to Schiller, I want to take this person with me too. Schiller muttered to himself for a bit and replied, although the orders were for one protector, it isn't forbidden to take a second with you as long as Marquis Gatton provides some additional compensation. However, I need to remind you that there is no loyalty with the people who come from the death camp. Only great power can force them into submission. My suggestion is to use an enslavement contract. You'll come to see that the investment is worth it. Richard nodded, turning towards the giant brute. Gangder had consciously kept a 15-meter distance from him, avoiding stepping into the danger zone. Richard asked him, then are you willing to bear a slave contract? Gangder laughed, if you need me to prove my loyalty, I gladly accept. As long as I can leave this damned place, as long as I can slaughter my way through a real battlefield, I can do anything. Look at this rough and tough axe, it can't handle the... Alright, I get it. Richard cut him off, turning to the dragon mage, Lena? The preparations are complete. Lena took out a crimson scroll, throwing it over to Gangder. The brute opened the scroll without hesitation, activating its power. A dark beam of light immediately bore through his chest, but even with the immense pain he only slightly bit his lip. Another black beam entered Richard's body. Magic enslavement contracts were rare and precious. Through it, Richard could cause intense pain, even serious damage whenever his heart desired. If he died, anyone contracted to him would experience a significant permanent drop in power. In Norland, where power meant everything, this sort of severe punishment was unbearable. An enslavement contract was far less powerful than a soul contract, but it was still an effective restriction. Everybody accompanying Richard on his journey this time would be bound to him in the same way, with the obvious exception of Flozan. Lena was still on her guard. When the contract was completed, she used soul magic again to carefully investigate Gangder and confirm that the contract was in effect. Richard then nodded his head in acknowledgement. Gangder then excitedly waved his giant axe and shouted at the other members of the death camp, you maggots. Your good days have arrived. I, Gangder, am finally getting the hell out of this damned place. You don't need to cower under my giant axe, praise your luck for that. Ha ha ha. Looking at the growling Gangder, Richard suddenly felt his head ache. He said to Schiller, this was your original best recommendation? If we're looking at the aspect of battle power, then yes. Of course, that was excluding Waterflower, Schiller replied expressionlessly. Richard studied Gangder again, as well as that eye-catching axe of his that was unable to handle the hunger. He sighed, "All right, let's get going. We still need to continue on the journey tomorrow, but if you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 114. Mock Off. Early morning the next day, the bolstered party headed back to Giantwood Town, embarking for Mock-Off Port in the east. When Flozen saw Waterflower and Gangder, she was a little shocked. However, obstacles surfaced even before the team took off. The party didn't have any horses that could withstand Gangder's weight. On top of that, none of the horses would even let Waterflower get close, forget letting her ride them. Richard eventually had to give his personal armored warhorse to Gangder, while Lena found the gentlest horse and fed it calming pills before Waterflower finally got on. It was only then that the journey began smoothly. Truth be told, Gangder and Waterflower would rather just run to Mock-Off on foot. To them, that was faster. After a 3-day-long journey, the small party finally made it to Mock-Off, a northeastern port city of the Sacred Alliance that boasted of natural protection from the winds. It was only because of the Constellation Harbor being closer to Faust that it was more frequently used. On top of that, there was a mountain range to the north of the port, but none of the surrounding regions had any specialties, which meant it could never prosper. The fief was basically independent, with its leader only seeming to vow loyalty to the Sacred Alliance Emperor on the surface. Morphan only paid their taxes for formality's sake, as the annual proof of his allegiance. In this city of only 10,000 people, he was the supreme ruler. A supreme ruler known for his audacious slaving business. Because of the port's location, Mock-Off had slaves of almost every race. From Grey Dwarves to the Nagas, and because of its nearly sovereign nature, even third-generation human nobles without position and certain elven and winged tribes. If the buyer paid a high enough price, they could even get their hands on creatures with royal blood in them. However, the sale of such merchandise was an underground business. The buyers needed wealth and status for the deal to take place, and these were all people who acquired bizarre things and creatures as trophies or for experiments. Every inch of Mock-Off's land exuded the scent of blood and money. Stepping into the port's lands, Richard was detained by a patrol team. With rune knights, light cavalry and mages in his party, they obviously weren't ordinary adventurers, basically as good as an army. This was enough to attract everyone's attention. Richard took the chance to observe the people who had stopped them. All 6 of the guards had both weapons and armor of superior quality, exceeding normal standards by at least 20%. The guards themselves were also at least level 5 each, giving one a sense of Mock-Off's power. The coachman who'd come along with Flozen was the one who negotiated with the guards. Once they saw the token of the eternal dragon that he gave them, their attitudes turned on the head. The leader sent 2 of his guards to report the group's arrival, before leading them personally to the city proper. Morphan was a middle-aged man who seemed more like a merchant than a portmaster, and negotiations with him went rather smoothly. He welcomed Richard and Flozen with appropriate enthusiasm, asking his men to bring the 2 to select slaves immediately. Their destination for this trip was a small slaving camp at the outskirts of the city. There were thrice as many guards here as in ordinary camps, making it clear how valuable the prisoners here were. There was another odd thing about this camp. Richard and Flozen did not hear the usual shouts and sounds of agony. The guards were the only ones moving around the large area, making the entire campsite look quite deserted. It was quite evident that the common slaves had been moved away. Richard followed Morphan's assistant to a shack in the north of the campsite. A pungent odor assaulted their noses the moment they stepped in, but ever since the death camp Richard seemed immune to such things. He showed no discomfort as he trailed the assistant, something that surprised the other party and caused him to re-evaluate this young mage. Even more surprising was that Flozen actually followed them this time around. Her expression was emotionless as usual, making her seem oblivious to the bad environment. Thick metal fences separated the shack into different cells. This place was the living quarters of the slaves, but only 7 slaves occupied the entire shack. Or rather, 7 groups of slaves. The biggest cell actually had 2 trolls within. Of course, the trolls attracted Richard's attention. They were an intelligent race that was found commonly in Norland, related by blood to both humans and therianthropes. Of course, this didn't stop them from having these cousins of theirs in their diets. The strength of a troll was as great as its size, with a mature adult easily surpassing a level 10 warrior in strength. They weren't dumb despite their big size, and in fact many believed that their intellect did not lose out to that of the humans and elves. That fact was evident merely from the number of mages and shamans in their ranks. When trolls reached a certain level of power, there was a chance for them to undergo a mutation. The most common of these was growing another head, with 2-headed trolls far surpassing their kin, be it in magic or physical strength. One often needed a team of adventurers of different classes with good chemistry to deal with such power. Richard saw these 2 trolls had yet to mature, their physiques being noticeably smaller than ordinary members of their race. However, an unnerving feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. They were clean, almost too clean to be trolls. And unlike ordinary trolls who were easily incensed, they were quite relaxed as well. Just as Richard was observing them, they too were looking at this boy before them. It was clear that they were smarter than normal. "Why are there 2 trolls here?" Richard asked. Morfan's assistant replied, "They were discovered by an adventurer team in the North Mountains. They used to live with an old druid. I hear he's the one who brought them up. He taught them language, writing, even magic. His influence left them with various human habits. And then?" Even if he asked, Richard could predict the latter part of the story. "Then," the assistant shrugged, "the team realized their worth, so they killed the druid and sold the trolls to us." Ah, this was the first time Master Morfan spent 10,000 on a single troll. But of course, these trolls are smart, far smarter than average. It also makes them far more dangerous. The assistant pointed to the taller and stronger one as he explained, "That one is a warrior, called medium rare. The one beside him is a mage, named Tiramisu." "Sorry, what?" If Richard's mouth had been filled with water, the assistant would have been sprayed down right about now. Trolls were commonly named after epic skills or weapons, like Flamefist or Giant Hammer. This was the first time he'd heard of such a unique name. If you find any errors, ads pop-up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 115. Mock off. The assistant laughed. "Special names, aren't they? These 2 are self-proclaimed gourmets. But be warned, as intelligent as they are, trolls are trolls. Intelligence doesn't relate to appetite, only danger. They see us as food. Don't count on them abiding by the laws, and don't have any hopes for their loyalty either. They only pledge loyalty to those who have the power to kill them in the moment." Tiramisu grew displeased upon hearing the ill words about him. "Ignorant human. Don't treat us as if we are ordinary trolls. We are gourmets." Richard laughed this time. These 2 trolls were interesting indeed, but he still decided to look through all 7 cells before making a choice. He'd already known Morfan would prepare a batch of unique slaves for him, but from the quality of these slaves it seemed like Morfan really viewed High Priestess Ferlin with great respect. Sadly, he couldn't take all of the slaves. The interplanar portal only allowed for a small number of people. There were mages, warriors, assassins, even a priest amongst the slaves, a real priest. It was beyond remarkable that one could abduct someone of faith, turning him into a slave. It caused Richard to grow curious about Morfan's background. An unusual entry was an elven bard. The man was quarter human and 3/4 sun elf, a rare species. His elven heritage made him look beautiful, so much so that he could pass as a beauty if he dressed as a girl. Another thing that caught Richard's attention was the last cell he visited. Inside was a drow warrior, a classical example of her race, arrogant, sultry, and murderous, with dark skin and long silver hair. When Richard first saw her, she was cowering in a dark corner of the cell, avoiding sunlight at all costs. Her dark skin made her almost indistinguishable from the shadows, and one would have missed her if they were not attentive. Dark elves were quite restricted in the day, but at night they turned into the most dangerous of opponents. This one was a warrior, not one of the dreaded shamans, but Morfan still priced her at 60,000 gold, more expensive than the two trolls combined. That was just the cold hard truth, though. The trolls were good for nothings apart from their use in battle, but the young and beautiful elf was different. Her main use wasn't on the field, it was instead on a soft and fluffy bed. She was worth the price for most royalty. Once they'd gone through everyone once, the assistant turned around and asked, "So? Have you made up your mind, young master?" Richard was still considering it, but Flozin was quick to speak, "The trolls and the bard." She then sensed Richard's inquisitive gaze, saying indifferently, "They have the potential to become saints. The rest do not." "You can probe their potential?" Richard asked in shock. He'd gone through a test when he first entered the Deep Blue as well, but he remembered it being an unbearably long and painful procedure. Flozin nodded, "Yes, but it has a great price. Such things drain my blessing, if I probe any further I will fall in level." Richard understood her immediately, walking over to the assistant and pointing Flozan's choices out, "I want these three." The assistant was rather dumbfounded at his choice, taking a glance at the drow. He didn't understand why she was not one of Richard's choices, given how many uses she had. The dark elf came from Morfan's personal collection, one that he'd curated for royalty. He'd only added this rare treasure here as a gesture of goodwill once he saw that Flozin had come along as well. But then, he had second thoughts as he looked at the elven bard. Royals had all sorts of bizarre fetishes, and this bard had more than one use as well. In fact, he might even have more uses than that elf. The assistant sorted his thoughts out, no longer doubting Richard's decision. He proceeded to finish his duty, explaining the precautions they had to take. "All right. I need to remind you that slaves are slaves, regardless of quality. None of them took on this role willingly, so you should not count on their loyalty. Be alert at all times, and prepared to deliver harsh punishments if the time calls for it." "No need to worry, I have contracts," Richard said, taking out a scroll for each slave. "Magic slave contracts. Okay, I understand. Still, young master, remember my words." The assistant's tone held respect, but his thoughts were otherwise. Although these contracts were the best assurance of a slave's loyalty, it depended on the situation. The scrolls in Richard's hands were almost the same price as the slaves. He would rather use that extra money to buy more slaves instead of being wasteful like this. There were plenty of ways to train them, and the occasional sacrifice of one or two was nothing. The trolls and the elf stood still as the contracts took effect, before following Richard out. The elven bard introduced himself, his background, and his skills using poetry. He was Ola Floatwind, the child of a strong sun-elf warrior and a half-elf. His impure heritage left him facing discrimination since birth, causing his mother to take him and wander alone. He was eventually captured by a team of adventurers, becoming a slave. However, Ola's bloodline abilities and talents started to show as he grew. He was currently a level 8 bard, and rather skilled at archery as well, all without any formal training. He would be 30 this year, but that only barely made him an adult amongst the elves who lived to 200 years of age. Bards were similar to clerics, mages, and assassins all at once. Those of this class mainly supported their party in battle. This wasn't a class Ola had chosen himself, it was something he had been forced into by slave traffickers to please the aristocrats and royalty. His beautiful soothing voice, striking looks, and aura made any banquet calm and satisfying. Some ladies even fell head over heels for him. Richard paid the assistant upon their arrival at Makov, and bought some equipment for his newly acquired slaves in the market. They quickly made their way to a docked ship without rest, starting their journey for the final goal of this journey. The ship was enormous, able to hold up to 500 people at once on a long-haul journey. Everyone occupying it was from either the Arcarans or the Church of the Eternal Dragon, carefully selected after multiple stringent tests. Apart from sailors and soldiers, they'd also brought along dozens of craftsmen of different specializations, as well about 10 low-level mages. Their destination this time was an island not on the Alliance's records, leaving Richard able to claim it for his own the moment he arrived. And Richard already had a name in mind for it, Yesvailu. It was a term from the ancient Elven language, meaning the beginning of everything. The passengers of this ship were to become the first settlers of Yesvailu, the first of Richard's citizens. And for this, Richard had added another 15,000 coins to the debt he owed the Arcarans. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 1, Chapter 116. Behind the Scenes. Having sailed the vast ocean for 3 whole days, the ship had long since departed from common routes. It was on the 4th morning that Yesvailu appeared on the horizon, an island over tens of kilometers wide with springs on the eastern mountains for water, and a forest that covered half of its land providing timber. After Richard stepped foot on the island, he had a small village and port set up. The ship dropped anchor, sending the group of people and their belongings through a smaller boat. Richard, Flozan, and Lena entered the forest, searching for a suitable area to set up the portal. As Richard's soul guard, Waterflower lurked in the vicinity as well. He could occasionally feel some faint joy from the girl through their connection, likely being related to having returned to the forest. Lena eventually decided on the foot of a small hill, taking magic crystals out of her spatial pouch to set up the formation. The formation was extremely complicated, requiring even the dragon mage 1 day at minimum to set up. That night, Richard had a few bonfires set up around the area. He sat down with Flozan at his side, grilling the prey that Waterflower had captured. Lena continued to work, placing crystals into their position from time to time as the formation flashed with a wondrous brilliance. They could see the bonfires at the shore from their location, with the tens of tents set up there. If his expedition into the plain was successful, future generations could stay here, using the port and village they were setting up. The bonfire flickered continuously, illuminating the two's faces from time to time. Neither spoke. Even if they were heading for a low-level plane, with nothing expected to happen, nobody could be sure of what they would face. On the eve of their expedition, the pressure had magnified itself in front of them. It was not a tranquil evening in Faust. Several griffins glided across the night sky, bathed in the brilliance of the 7 moons as their riders skillfully landed them onto the first island of Faust's 7th layer. Several important figures gathered in a lavish and spacious living room, representing not themselves but the families standing behind them. Between the two sides sat a stern-looking old man. This was Duke Bicker Mensa, the head of the Mensas that occupied what was commonly called Island 7-1. Like the Josephs, the Mensas were well-known aristocrats that had their legacies passed down through generations. Their existence was even older than that of the Sacred Alliance, their power evident just from their position amongst the 14. On the Duke's left was Baron Raymond Joseph, while on his right was a handsome yet sinister-looking youth. That was Viscount Dasher of the Wellington family, true big shots that occupied the island 6-3. As for the last representative, the one from the Shumpaters that occupied island 7-7, he could only sit further away, at the side of Viscount Dasher. These 4 families combined made for an extremely powerful force. As for the issue that had gathered them all together, the threat of the Arcarans, of Richard Arcaran. Paying his greetings and respect to the Duke, Raymond surveyed everyone in the room before he spoke solemnly. Everyone, the Arcarans have not been on the floating islands of Faust for even 2 years, with only 3 sacrifices to their name, but they've already managed to have their island shift. I'm sure everyone present here is quite clear on what that means. We cannot allow this group of lunatics to expand any further, and need to adopt a powerful strategy to suppress them. The first target is Richard Arcaran. I've gathered that he's not just a student of the legendary mage, but also someone who has the potential to become a Grand Runemaster in the future. Indeed, a Grand Runemaster. That isn't something I'm exaggerating in order to incite action. My latest reports say that a compoundable rune he crafted was sold on auction for over 5 million gold. Pat, the Schumpeter family representative, slapped the sides of his seat, saying passionately, "If we'd known that earlier, we would have killed him the night he went to the ceremony with Gatton." Dasher harumphed, saying cynically, "Kill him?" "I heard there were several families waiting in the dark to ambush them, but nobody dared step up in the end. Being this afraid of Gatton, I'm sure the Schumpeters were amongst those in ambush." The representative of the Schumpeters turned red with anger, but he didn't dare rebuke the Viscount. As the family occupying the seventh island, they were in an extremely awkward position, having to face the onslaught of any new entrants first. They needed the Wellingtons' support in crucial moments. However, given their sensitive position, how would they dare arouse the wrath of the Archerans? If they started a war with that bunch of lunatics, even if they managed to survive, they would lose an immense amount of resources. Who knows if any of the families eyeing the floating islands would seize the opportunity and attack them? And this was all assuming they would be able to withstand an Archeran assault, something even this representative himself doubted. Gatton had cleanly destroyed the family that had occupied Island 7-3, engaging in a full frontal war with someone like him? Don't even think about it. Even the nemesis of the Archerans, the Josephs, would never do such a foolish thing. Raymond spoke up to dispel the awkward atmosphere. "Everyone. According to what I know, it wasn't Gatton that performed the ceremony that night. It was Richard." "Richard?" Duke Mensa snorted and furrowed his brows. "The fellow seems to have left Faust the moment the ceremony ended. He likely obtained a powerful time-related blessing. If he's lucky enough, it could even have been prolonged life, or accelerated time in a different plane. The next time we see him, he could very well pose a huge threat to us. If he was blessed with innate talent, or a specific rune, we might be facing a Saint Runemaster in the future. Don't forget Saint Peter and his legendary divine set," Raymond added. The atmosphere in the discussion room turned gloomy in an instant. All those present acknowledged the threat Richard posed from the information they had been provided. It greatly increased the level of his threat even beyond Alice, putting him second in the Archerans only to Gatton himself. And the most terrible thing? He received even more blessings than Gatton. Even if everyone present knew the Josephs had some selfish desire in their proposition, the rest were just the same. Gatton's shadow was like a sword looming over their heads, and the very first to be beheaded might just be the Josephs. Duke Mensa eventually made up his mind, breaking the long silence. "We have to take action. We cannot let Richard grow in power. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 1, Chapter 117. Behind the Scenes. Take action? Dasher looked at the Duke with contempt, snorting, "What kind of action? Richard left Faust a week ago, his destination unknown. He's definitely embarked on an expedition to a plane, and don't dream of getting the coordinates anytime soon. High Priestess Ferlin even had Daybreak accompany him. Do you think we'll be able to get the location out of the Church of the Eternal Dragon? Richard and Flozan. You haven't realized? Raymond asked with a smile. He didn't seem dismayed, instead very confident. Dasher's face darkened, and he obviously wasn't happy with Raymond's behavior. Although they both occupied the same layer, the Wellingtons were undeniably far stronger than the Josephs. In fact, the Josephs had only lost power through their war of attrition with the Archerans. However, Raymond didn't continue to keep them guessing. Richard and Flozan being together will mean that they're going to a low-level plane. A party formed for such an expedition will be limited to level 10 or so. We don't have to get the coordinates from Gatton or the church. In fact, we don't have to get the coordinates at all. As long as we're able to shift where they end up, our plans can be achieved. You mean to? Dasher's eyes flashed. He didn't seem to dislike this fellow as much anymore. Raymond immediately replied, "Simple. We can perform a ceremony of our own, using the entirety of the blessing to change the coordinates Richard will be teleporting to. Turn it into an intermediate plane that needs those at least at level 18 to conquer. Then we can get the coordinates for this new plane, and send our own parties to vie for the resources there. While we're at it, we can have Richard killed as well. The laws allow us to send expeditions capped at level 15, so it won't be a huge strain on our resources and won't draw the attention of the Arcarans. And based on levels alone we'll have an absolute advantage over his party. Duke Mensa pondered for a while before speaking. This is a good idea, but it has already been a week. Sacrifices could only change the future, not the past. Raymond added in a hurry, he should still be off somewhere making preparations. We've always had our eyes on important Arcarans, and Richard definitely didn't have the resources for an expedition prepared before the ceremony. We must still strike quickly, however, our time is running out. Raymond's confidence caused the representatives of the other families to exchange looks. With the two families being arch-enemies, the Joseph spying on the Arcarans was nothing new. Duke Mensa chimed in, Richard's blessings weren't low. We'll need a ceremony with thrice the offerings. We'll be able to accomplish that if we divide it amongst ourselves, Dasher interjected. He then turned to the Schumpeter representative, frowning, as for you guys. The Schumpeters had just performed a ceremony a few months ago, and their strength had dropped greatly in recent years. They wouldn't be able to take anything decent out of their vaults. However, they would definitely be thrown out of this circle if they didn't make any contributions at a time like this. When Dasher's gaze swept past him, the Schumpeter's representative gritted his teeth and said, leave the boy to us. We'll divide the resources from the new plane equally amongst our families. It won't be that easy to deal with those two. Dasher didn't release his hold on the man who'll be in charge of the mission? The Schumpeter representative gritted his teeth again, Sinclair. Very well then, it's all settled. Dasher seemed to be satisfied, a rare sight. He moved the discussion forward, discussing the sacrifices with the other two. Midnight. Duke Mensa personally led a party of knights to the Church of the Eternal Dragon, beginning a ceremony in a bid to obtain blessings. This was supposed to be a low-grade ceremony arranged at the last minute, so Derlin herself did not show up. A random priestess would be enough to officiate. Once the ceremony began, however, the light in the church grew more and more radiant. Divine energy surged from the void, and just the sheer amount of it indicated that this was the highest grade of ceremony. This was an extremely rare occurrence, causing the officiating priestess to nearly faint with happiness. Such a grand ceremony wouldn't normally be open for her to conduct, so this was a blessing. She was even more solicitous than usual afterwards, personally escorting the Duke out of the church. The ceremony performed in the middle of the night was a hot topic in aristocratic circles for a few weeks. Duke Mensa's close friends visited him on occasion, congratulating him. They all believed that such a great blessing would cement his position in the Sacred Alliance further, perhaps to the point that he wouldn't have to worry about the Arcaran threat anymore. Every time, Duke Mensa only expressed his gratitude. He didn't reveal any details of the ceremony, leaving these close friends with no information about the events leading up to it. Richard had no idea of the events that had unfolded in Faust. They were on the eve of departure, the final night of preparations finally here. And that passed quickly as well, between the headcount, preparing equipment, readying themselves for emergencies, and many other little matters like that. The sun had crept its way back onto the horizon. Lena had already prepared the formation, leaving it awaiting activation. She remained prudent, ensuring that there were no problems with the coordinates repeatedly. Richard made a final confirmation as well, just before he would teleport away. The party this time consisted of him, Flozen, Waterflower, Ganger, the Trolls, Ola, and a small group of foot soldiers provided by the Arcarans. Nobody except Richard, Flozen, and Waterflower carried high-grade equipment, so they wouldn't have to use much energy for teleportation, and all of his runecrafting supplies were stuffed into 2 large boxes. Once she ascertained that everything was in place, Lena activated the portal. Immense mana surged from the crystals placed all over the formation, tearing the void above it until an ancient law stabilized the rift. It eventually formed a portal that they would be able to pass through one at a time. The foot soldiers were the first through the portal, followed by Gangder, the trolls, and then the rest. Once Flozen stepped through as well, Richard was the only one remaining. "Wait a minute," Lena called out, walking up to Richard. "Good luck, little Richard." "Thank you." Richard smiled, wanting to shake her hand. However, the dragon mage instead gave him a warm hug, one so tight that Richard could distinctly feel her figure pressing into his body. However, it conveyed her sincere well wishes and concern. Richard walked back to the portal. In the final moment before he left, he turned around and waved, "I'll definitely return." There was a common saying amongst those of Norland embarking on an expedition: the portal was like a mirror. But one step, and one would end up in an entirely different world. Nobody knew what they would encounter in the other plane, forget whether they could grow a base and stabilize their position there, obtaining resources and returning home. Once Richard stepped foot through the portal, nobody knew when it would be that he stepped back onto the soil of Norland once more. Seeing the boy's figure disappear through the portal, Lena felt a sudden urge to cry. It wasn't because Richard was special, but because this scene brought back many memories from the past. This wasn't the first time the dragon mage was setting up a portal to a different plane, personally sending off many people on their journeys. There were strangers, comrades, family members, friends, and lovers. They were all bold, decisive, and intelligent, and were outstanding people of their times. Many of them had remained uncontactable since. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 1. A Mishap. The feeling of passing through a planar portal was about the same as any other. One's consciousness blanked for a brief moment, before glitching back into existence. It felt longer than usual, though, but then again they'd crossed an immeasurable distance in a mere few seconds. Our Sharon men were waiting at the other side, having built a reconnaissance base and set up a lighthouse of time to guide those who came afterwards. In the vast and chaotic currents of time and space, the lighthouse of time would provide a stable position to lock onto, preventing the traveler from losing their way to a deviation in the teleportation route that was set up on short notice. According to the information Richard had acquired, the base wasn't particularly large. Even including the natives they'd subjugated, there weren't more than 50 people present, and the place was barely larger than an adventuring party's camp. 17 of the Arkarans sent out in the original party had survived, having explored less than 50 kilometers out. It could be said that they were still rather clueless about the plane's situation. However, the coordinates of every stable plane were extremely precious. Once the plane was completely conquered, it would result in a large fortune and innumerable resources. Gatton only had one unconquered lesser plane himself, so Richard didn't exactly have a choice. Richard was already quite satisfied with lodging at a relatively safe base, with men who'd arrived beforehand and were already familiar with the environment. Many of the initial dangers involved in planar travel had already been avoided. A burst of dazzling white light appeared in Richard's sight. It blinded and hurt him, taking away the colorful lights that had pervaded his vision up to that point. There were no dazzling lights when he regained vision, however. He instead saw a cloudy sky, with trees and mountains around. A gentle breeze blew past his face, telling Richard that a whole new world had opened up ahead of him. Outside of the purple flora, everything present looked quite the same as Norland. It was unknown whether it was due to a particular season or it was normal all year round, but the mountain range that stretched endlessly under the azure sky was covered in various shades of purple that exuded vitality. However, there was barely any time for Richard to admire the scenery of the plain. A strong sense of danger suddenly welled up in his heart, and the sharp whistle of the wind suddenly rang in his ears. A cry rang out, and from the corner of his eye Richard saw Waterflower charging towards him. Waterflower pinned Richard to the ground, and an arrow whizzed past them right after to bury itself right next to his cheek. The strong winds hurt his eyes, the arrow still making a disturbing hum as it vibrated in the earth. Although this was a close shave with death, Richard was a lot calmer this time. Enemy attack. That was the first thing that came to his mind. Follow me, Waterflower said stiffly. She leapt up like a cheetah, her figure constantly switching between paths. She took a winding path as she charged towards a tree not far away. Richard flipped onto his feet as well, swiftly running alongside her. A novice knight was running as well, not far from them. However, he'd barely taken a few steps before some arrows whizzed by and pinned him down. A sharp whistle rang in the air as a hatchet flew over, burying itself into his back. The knight shouted in agony before collapsing to the ground. It was only then that Richard managed to distinguish between the various sounds he heard in his ear. Murderous screams echoed from every direction, making it clear that they had been surrounded. Incessant howls of agony rang out from the jungle, many of them from voices he was familiar with. The ones he didn't recognize sounded foreign and strange, they had to be from the enemies. Richard rapidly took note of his surroundings. This was a sparse forest, a mixture of various trees and shrubs. There was only the occasional bulky tree that seemed old, with agile soldiers running amongst them. They took cover behind the trees and bushes, inching closer to their location. Just from their movements Richard could tell that all of these enemies were level 5 or higher. They were familiar with battle in the woods, with a large number of archers amongst them. The only good news was that there were no signs of magic yet. As he was looking at all this, Richard jumped towards the large tree that Waterflower had found. Once he was under cover, the young lady leapt forward like a wolf, charging towards the approaching enemies in the depths of the jungle with extraordinary agility. He was quite confident in her ability to deal with multiple lower-level opponents in a forest environment. Surely enough, endless shrieks soon echoed around the area. Waterflower was like a true wolf hiding in the woods, pouncing from fallen enemy to enemy. Richard composed himself, quickly buffing himself with a magical shield and stone skin. He then began to make his own way towards the most intense part of the battle. He heard Gangder snarl right ahead of him, following which the huge figure charged through 2 trees that were bound closely together. The hanging vines didn't hinder the brute in the least, falling to the ground one after the other as if they were cut off by sharp blades. With more than half of his upper body already bared, the long arrow stuck into his back was quite noticeable. However, all of Gangder's body was radiating with vengeance. It was evident that the arrow wouldn't affect his might in battle, as he wielded an unknown's tree trunk that was even thicker than his arm. The trunk was colored a sticky red and white, blood and brain matter all over it. There were unsettling movements in the shadows surrounding them. The enemies were cautiously closing in on them, but neither that nor the injuries seemed to affect the part giant's fighting spirit. On the contrary, it only made him more ferocious. He took large strides forward, brandishing the large trunk in his hand. His heavy footsteps shook the ground relentlessly, while his snarls reverberated in the jungle. "You lowly creatures! Get yourselves out here and face your deaths! Don't think these toothpicks of trees will save you, I can smell your stink from kilometers away. Look at this axe in my..." Gangder's voice came to a halt. He looked at the tree trunk in his hand, unsure as to how he should continue. All their weapons were transported together in a chest when they teleported, cutting down on the mana required to run the formation. His axe wasn't in his hand right now, instead packed tightly into the chest. However, it was evident that the slaughter was more important than his war cry. Gangder only paused for a moment, before continuing with his roar, "No weapon in my hand can handle the hunger. Shudder, you lowly creatures!" Whoosh! The response Gangder got was an arrow, shot forth towards him from behind. However, he displayed an agility not befitting of his build. In a flash he'd leapt to the side, easily dodging it. The trunk in his hands flew out into the jungle, ruthlessly smashing into a half-exposed archer. The cracking of bones rang out, and the archer's body instantly distorted. The man couldn't even manage a groan before collapsing. Gangder looked around for another weapon, but not finding anything he resorted to tearing down a nearby tree and holding it in his hand. The commotion of battle suddenly grew intense in another direction. For knights tightly encircled Flozan to protect her, continuing to retreat. They weren't armed well, with only one of them having a shield in hand while the others had to make do with long swords and axes. Sharp arrows rained down on them from the jungle, leaving all of the knights injured. However, their bodies were all shining with a faint radiance. Every time the tip of an arrow touched this glow, it came to a halt like it had fallen into water. The force of the arrows was halved at minimum. Ranged shield was a spell common to clerics and mages, one of the most practical of the elementary spellbook. Even in an unfavorable situation, Flozan appeared calm and collected. Although she was on the move as well, she was casting spells cleanly on the knights, one by one. The spells replenished their shields, and healed those who'd suffered more serious injuries. Although she was casting elementary spells, they were shot out one after the other. It was like she had inexhaustible power. A burst of laughter suddenly echoed from the woods opposite Flozan, sounding like grinding metal. A voice rang out, saying the same thing again and again. The cleric immediately cast a language proficiency spell, hearing what the other party had to say. "Foreign invaders, you've landed in the hands of Sir Kojo. Don't even think of putting up a struggle. I'll kill all of you, and hang your bodies in front of the Baron's castle to show everyone in the lands how invaders end up. Ha 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 ha. Dot. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible." Book 2 Chapter 2. A Mishap, 2. A soldier who was fully covered in glistening silver armor emerged from the shrubs to the tune of booming laughter. He took wide steps, followed by dozens of others who rushed forth in order. They divided themselves evenly, flanking Flozan and her knights in an arc. However, a burning fireball suddenly shot out from the forest, heading for the soldiers furthest away. This Sir Kojo exclaimed in shock, "Damn it, they have a mage! Defensive mode, now!" With the spell being launched from so close, it was definitely too late to make any adjustments to their formation. Running wildly would only make them active targets for the opponents. Thus, they could only make use of the time between the mage's spells to adjust their positions, deciding whether to retreat or advance. Crouching behind one's shield was an effective way to withstand fireballs. Those without could only pray for luck. Kojo kneeled at once, his body hunching as he buried his sword into the ground in front of him. The wide blade in his arm served to cover most of his vital parts, as he gathered energy for a defensive layer around himself. However, a second fireball shot out from the depths of the forest before the first had even landed in place. The knight's hands trembled at once. There was another mage. There was just a second between the fireballs. Two mages had to be casting them around the same time. There wasn't much time for him to think, with the first fireball already having exploded loudly. Blazing waves of heat surged through the area, engulfing him and nearly half of his troop. Kojo heard a chilling voice sound from amidst the ringing of the explosions. "I really must thank you, Sir Kojo. If I didn't know your position, I would not be able to determine your power." The opponent was talking in common tongue, but his pacing was monotonous and his tone completely flat. This was a typical language comprehension spell. Indeed, they were invaders from a foreign plane. Kojo roared in fury, but two more fireballs were shot out of the jungle at the same time. All four were placed in a square around Kojo, with him at the center of the converging blasts. Such control was extremely good. The earliest fireball had landed the farthest, while the last was closer. In a mere 2 breaths of time, the entire area was set ablaze. The soldiers who were originally the farthest and fastest to set off rushed out of the fire, but even they were burned by the enchanted flames. They rolled on the ground, leaking long howls. As for those near the center, there were no signs of struggle from them. Right at the center of it all, Kojo bitterly endured all the heat waves engulfing him one after the other. For surges of heat assaulted him less than a second apart, depleting almost all of his energy. When the final blast passed him, the knight disregarded the excruciating pain of his burns and struggled onto his feet. Just as he raised his head, he saw Richard taking large strides towards him, sprinting with another fireball conjured in his hand. He moved close until he was less than 20 meters away. "You wretched lunatic! Curse you!" Kojo was so alarmed that his hairs were almost all standing. He no longer had time to consider how many mages there were exactly in the jungle. This was the first time one was charging towards him directly in the battlefield, and this one had a lethal spell in hand. Richard slightly shoved his hand forward, causing an unavoidable fireball to zoom over towards the knight. Kojo let out a bellow of rage, drawing on his energy once more as he raised his enormous sword up high, bringing it down in a flash to strike the spell coming towards him. The fireball exploded, the force of the impact flinging him up in the air. The energy radiating from his armor flickered a few times, before eventually dying out completely. Attacking a fireball directly only slightly decreased the damage it could do, unless they had enchantments or were using enough energy to weaken the magic. Warriors still had to rely on their armor and shields to withstand the heat waves. Kojo fell heavily to the floor, his helmet falling off to reveal a face that was already burned black and red. His lush beard and hair had long turned to cinders in the high temperature. Despite his skill in battle techniques, the knight hadn't been able to withstand Richard's 5 consecutive fireballs. The only reason he was still alive now was because of his excellent energy reserves, which was in part due to his superior armor. He struggled his way up once again. He glared at Richard like a wounded lion, only his left eye open as his right bled profusely. He barely managed to steady himself, saying with a sardonic smile, "Insignificant bastards from a foreign plane, don't get too ahead of yourselves. You'll all die very soon, alright?" Richard lifted his hand, making a slash in the air as he said coldly, "You'll be first." Kojo seemed like he wanted to say something else, but Waterflower's graceful figure had already appeared from the woods in a flash. Her movements were quick yet soundless, the 45-degree angle her body made with the ground making her look like a ghastly bolt of lightning. She moved behind Kojo at once, the shepherd of eternal rest flashing in her hand. Kojo's head suddenly flew up high, forming an arc of blood in the sky. However, his body stood up straight as before, refusing to collapse even as blood spurted from the neck. Waterflower herself staggered for a moment upon performing the blow. That stunning move earlier had used up more than half of her own power. Just as she began to recover a bit, she heard Richard's sudden roar, "Get behind cover." Years living on the edge had given her the experience to leap instantly. She flipped a few times, making her way behind a large tree quite quickly. 2 short spears whizzed by, burying themselves into the ground that she'd been standing upon but a moment ago. "There are still enemies here. Kill them all!" Richard roared loudly, choosing to charge forward instead of retreat. He forged ahead, taking large strides towards the soldiers emerging from the jungle. As he advanced, he had already begun to chant his spells. When he brushed past Flozen, Richard pointed his right hand to the front. An intense pulse of magic ran through the area, before 4 brutal boars were spawned in the forest, charging towards Kojo's soldiers ferociously. The 4 creatures weighed more than 100 kilos each, but they sprinted wildly, with frightening energy. They had long fangs and sharp bones on the back, all deadly weapons. Their hooves, harder than rock, caused the earth to rumble like thunder as they charged across the forest. Even Kojo, were he still around, would have to take these boars seriously. With the remaining soldiers being around level 5 or 6, they couldn't even take them on one-on-one. When they collided with the boars, they suddenly discovered that these magical creatures were more difficult to deal with than they had expected. All of the brutal boars were sparkling, covered by a faint divine radiance. They'd completely transformed into a whole new level of threat after a blessing had been cast on them. Flozen remained silent, having cast the blessing with a mere wave of her hands. She hadn't chanted any spells aloud from the start. It seemed like all of her spells could be cast silently, and her reserves seemed endless. As Richard saw the 4 brutal boars disrupt the enemy's line of battle, he finally let out a breath. Everything in front of him went black at once, causing him to nearly fall. A warm, soft, yet strong body supported his weight. Soon after, an icy streak of spiritual power was instilled in his body, letting his drained mana recover faster. Grade 3 spell, Vitality. It had come just in time. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 3. A Mishap, 3. The 4 knights originally guarding Flozan had already dispersed to the sides, ready to face their enemies who'd freed themselves from the boars head-on. Now, the only person left supporting Richard was Flozan. Before Richard even had the time to express his gratitude, 3 warriors were charging them down. With the knights tangled up, they likely realized that it was best to dash towards the mages in a straight line. Unable to break away from the enemies that outnumbered them, Richard's knights were helpless as the warriors pounced towards him. Richard quietly tried to gather some mana, but gave up quite quickly. He didn't have enough to power even a single fireball, but the warriors were so close that he could see the flames burning in their sinister gazes. His face flushed a peculiar shade of scarlet on this line between life and death, and strands of hair flew back as he leaped forward to dash right between one of the warriors. Bang! The collision was loud and powerful, taking the warrior by surprise. He stumbled backwards immediately, spouting fresh red blood all over his opponent. With Eruption having been activated, Richard was currently no weaker than a level 10 warrior. The level 5 opponent was seriously injured in just the one frontal collision. Richard himself already took advantage of the moment to remove the axe the man had in his hands. The amber second moon suddenly flashed out above his head, moonforce flowing into his body at an astonishing speed. He placed the axe level with his body, spinning on the spot to leave a ring of yellow sweeping past the remaining warriors. Silver Moon Secret Sword, Ring of Destiny. The 2 aggressors were still charging at full speed, and nothing seemed to be out of place for the first few steps they took. However, just as the edges of their swords approached Flozan, they staggered, unable to stand steadily as they split in twain. The amber ring of light had been powerful enough to separate arms from their bodies, leaving unbelievably deep wounds on their lower torsos. Shocked out of their wits, the 2 warriors howled loudly as they pressed on the wounds with all their might. Blood and innards spilled out wildly, however, not enough for the single remaining hands to stop. The violent struggles only made it worse, blood spurting out like a fountain as the cries quickly grew faint. Even that quickly faded away. The amber moon disappeared silently, the axe in Richard's hand spotless and free of any trace of blood. He rested the head of the axe on the ground, staring calmly at the enemies who were standing mere meters away. Even though the warriors had an absolute advantage in numbers, none of them dared to take a single step forward. Richard glanced at the axe in his hands, noting with a beautiful but cruel smile, "This seems to be a little too sharp." Color immediately drained from the volunteers' faces, and they retreated by instinct. Even veteran warriors would grow fearful when faced with a homicidal maniac who found joy in torture and blood. However, explosive claps rang out from the forest behind them. The woods were instantly engulfed in smoke and dust, with trees collapsing continuously. It was so much more chaotic than the encounter with the boars, almost as if some gigantic beast were charging through. All of a sudden, 2 archers flew out of the woods, crashing heavily onto the floors. Their bodies lay there, unmoving and at weird angles. It was obvious that they hadn't come out willingly. The shrubbery surrounding them collapsed, a loud explosion sounding as 2 trolls rushed out of the dust with a thunderous snarl. Each one had a thick tree trunk on hand, with no regard for the class of opponent they were facing as they smashed heads in without exception. Absorbed in the chase, they even knocked nearby trees aside, roots and all. The arrows raining down on them were ineffective as well, the archers had no vision. More than half of the trolls' bodies were covered by branches and leaves. Both trolls had several arrows stuck in their bodies, but their naturally tough skin and thick fat made for armor of its own. The arrows were like mere toothpicks, not hindering their movements at all. They did not observe the surroundings, nor did they have any concept of teamwork. All they did was to dash directly into the front lines of the remaining troops, sending 2 or 3 warriors flying with every wave of the trunks in their hands. One of the Archaran knights would have been sent flying as well, had he not ducked away in time. Tiramisu didn't even look like a mage, wielding his trunk with the same ferocity that medium rare did. Gangder rushed over as well, roaring his way into battle. His body was covered with flesh wounds, but looking at the blood on the trunk in his hand, his opponents must have been corpses by now. Waterflower bounded over behind his enormous frame, making no sounds regardless of whether she stepped on solid ground or twigs. The Shepherd of Eternal Rest was resting diagonally in her hand, not stained by a single drop of blood even though it had obviously seen its fair share. Completely surrounded, the last dozen or so warriors were cut down in a flash, leaving only a handful of critically injured survivors. Richard seemed to remain unfazed, standing straight with the axe still on the ground. The smile on his face hadn't faded in the least as Flozen walked over stealthily, patting him on the back and whispering, "Hey! There's no enemies left." To her utter surprise, Richard went weak at her slightest touch. She held her hands out to catch him in a hurry, but couldn't prop his heavy body up for long. Just as she was about to collapse under his weight, a white shadow flashed past her. Before she knew it, Waterflower was already on the right, helping her support Richard. Having overdrafted his mana, using eruption, and forcefully executing a secret sword left Richard completely spent. He'd been near unconscious by the last sentence, barely holding up his intimidation on the strength of will alone. Flozen and Waterflower laid Richard flat on the ground. The cleric raised her hand, about to cast a vitality spell on Richard, but the boy caught her arm. Seeing her startled expression, he responded weakly, "There's many injured. I'll be fine after some rest, don't waste your power on me, but." Flozen cast a meaningful glance at Richard, standing up without protest and walking towards the injured. She cast minor healing on everyone, ensuring that outside of severe injuries everyone would heal in 3 days at most. Resting in Waterflower's arms, however, Richard started to gasp more violently. The mana depletion this time was a lot more unbearable than he had expected. All he wanted to do was to close his eyes, but he knew that at such a time he could not afford to lose consciousness lest his mana pool be damaged. He struggled to ask, "Is there anything that can keep me awake?" "Alcohol." Tiramisu chimed. "Some very strong alcohol." Medium rare emphasized. Both trolls then turned to face Gangder, staring straight at him. The brute eyed the 2 trolls suspiciously before rummaging through his fabric belt, finally finding a small silver bottle that he passed to Waterflower. A strong alcoholic smell hit everyone as she unscrewed the bottle. Waterflower took a deep sniff, even tasting the drink with her tongue before she eventually let Richard take a big gulp. Gangder immediately yelled angrily, "Hey, that's uncalled for. That's a drink I made for myself. Do you really think I'd poison myself?" "Hard to say," Waterflower replied harshly, glaring coldly at Gangder. "Waterflower!" Gangder roared, grasping the trunk in his hand tightly. However, Waterflower stared at him with a poker face. Her fair, slender right hand was placed right on the Shepherd of Eternal Rest by her side. Gangder's expression fell as his gaze darted between the trunk in his hand and the sword in hers. At last, he shouted begrudgingly, "Don't you dare use that sword." Waterflower just stared at Gangder pitifully, almost like she was looking at an idiot. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2 Chapter 4 Annihilation. Richard downed half the bottle of alcohol, and some warmth began to radiate from his stomach. He felt better quickly, struggling to stand. "Knock it off." "Where's Ola?" "I heard his voice coming from that direction," Gangder replied immediately. "I'll look for him." He then headed deep into the forest in a bid to avoid the awkward situation. Richard shook his head with a wry smile, ordering the soldiers who could still stand to scour the battlefield. The trolls were put on sentry duty, to ensure that there were no more enemies hiding in the woods. Their naturally keen sense of smell would help sniff any out. Of course, any enemies present should only be stragglers. Over 50 warriors had died trying to kill Richard's party, and that had to be around the limit of what a mere knight could command. The knight's strength had already caused Richard some shock. Flozan had finished with the treatments at that point, returning to Richard's side. Her face was somewhat pale, but Richard looked at her intently before saying, "You seem to have an endless supply of holy spells." Flozan looked at Richard, asking him in an indifferent manner befitting of her class, "I saw someone summon 4 brutal boars just earlier. Which powerful god of magic gave you the gift to summon a full 4 boars?" A grade 4 summoning spell could only bring forth 1 or 2 boars. Even with enhancement, the spell would normally limit it to 3. Without any special additions, even a great mage would not be able to summon 4 boars with a grade 4 spell. Richard snickered, not continuing the conversation with this cleric that seemed not to run out of mana. They soon had proper information on the state of the battlefield. A total of 69 enemies had died, including Kojo, with 10 heavily injured and just 2 unscathed. This was over 70 elites, far surpassing the forces a Norland knight could command. Some of the poorer barons only had that many warriors under them. Gangder found Ola after some time, unconscious in the forest with 2 arrows stuck in his body. Fortunately, Flozan used the last dregs of power she had to cast a greater heal on him, preserving his life. 3 of the 10 soldiers who'd come with Richard had died, while 2 more were heavily injured. However, they managed to find the supplies they'd sent through the portal, with 2 crates of armor, 1 of weapons, and 1 with ingredients. Richard immediately had the survivors arm themselves. Questioning the captives proved difficult. Be it the heavily injured ones or the 2 without much damage, not a word came out of their mouths. Thankfully, some information could be made out through their curses. For example, one of their gods had decreed the arrival of invaders. Kojo was the knight in charge of the reconnaissance party, and the one to follow right after would be a baron. This meant that their encounter with the soldiers was premeditated, which is why they went under attack the moment they made it through. Their entire group was scattered, with each of them left to fend for themselves. If not for their individual power, they would have been annihilated on the spot. Richard's mind grew clouded, and he looked at Flozan. Her brows were furrowed. This plane had gods, and their enemies had strong faith. This was definitely not good news to a priestess, or for that matter to Richard. It meant he would need to spend more effort gathering information. However, there was something else which required his attention immediately. "Where is the base that we will be setting up in?" Richard asked. The receiving end of the portal was supposed to have a base set up, but they'd appeared in a forest instead. One of the soldiers Richard had sent out to scout returned soon. "Lord Richard, I've found the base. But there isn't a single person there." The base was just a kilometer away, and the foot soldier couldn't seem to explain himself well, so Richard eventually decided to go there personally to have a look. If there was something that he did not understand, Flozan would most likely know it herself. However, when they found the base, even the indifferent Flozan was somewhat stupefied. The base was the size of a small village, the only difference being a layer of tall, strong walls surrounding it with a tower for scouts and archers that could fit 3 people. Even with the tall walls, the tower in the middle of the camp was visible, and if one looked close enough they could see the runes inscribed on it in the shape of an hourglass. The top was flat-roofed, with torches on it that were supposed to be lit with the eternal flames of time. This was the Lighthouse of Time, the most important construct here that was supposed to have led them on their way. The entire camp being eerily empty caused one to be flustered. The flames of time were already extinguished for who knows how long, with the gates wide open. Several huts could be seen inside, some with their doors ajar, but there seemed to be no activity whatsoever. As Richard was about to enter, he was stopped by Waterflower. She jumped onto the wall, her sword in hand as she looked around. She sniffed the surroundings before nodding her head and jumping in. Gangder had a shield in his left hand and a giant axe in his right, storming through the gates. Medium rare and tiramisu followed, the latter's magic defense and iron skin spells finally proving that she was a mage. Only after nearly everyone else entered did Flozan let go of Richard's hands. However, she was still holding on to his robes. "I'm not that important." Richard smiled wryly at Flozan. "If you die, so will Waterflower. The others will lose power as well," Flozan said solemnly. "Why would you be concerned with all that?" Richard attempted to reason with her. "The Dragon of Eternity and Light values you more than me." "I cannot allow you to die," Flozan said seriously. Richard didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he spoke in an equally solemn manner, "But I've never had the habit of letting a woman defend me." "Is that a tradition of the Archerons?" Flozan asked. Probably. It was a simple question, but one Richard found difficult to answer. Fortunately, the cleric didn't dwell on the matter, instead letting go. However, 5 or 6 holy spells were cast on him by the time he took a few steps. Physical shielding, magic resistance, ranged shielding, poison immunity. There was even a rejuvenation spell. Richard's body shone in all sorts of colors, becoming extremely dazzling. Under such circumstances, it would be difficult for him to die even if he wanted to. Richard and Flozan finally entered the base after this minor episode. There was a strange aura all around, so Richard ordered the soldiers to search the perimeter just to be safe, notifying the rest with a whistle if there was an ambush waiting. The base wasn't large at all, and it took less than 10 minutes for the party to survey everything within. Standing on the empty ground in the center, Richard's expression had grown extremely serious. Flozan walked out from a hut near him, her expression not good either. There were huts designed for a single person to occupy here, but there were also bunks for soldiers, a granary, an armory, and a general-purpose warehouse. This was alongside a smithy, a lab, and even a small pub. However, no matter where one looked, there was no sight of anyone at all. There was still some food left on the stove, but the firewood underneath was burned out. There were dishes placed on the bar, with a half-eaten steak on the ground. Armor, weapons, and clothes were strewn across the area, every pile being a perfect set of undergarments, robes, outer clothing, and armor. If a stark-naked man walked over and picked a bundle off the ground, all he needed was a weapon to be fully armed. Of course, there were other sets as well, like those belonging to cooks, mages, and maids. While all these sets were present, the people who should be wearing them were not. It seemed like they had all vanished at once, without any resistance to speak of. It was absurd. The scouts returned to Richard, but everyone was left alarmed by the bizarre scene. They subconsciously gripped their weapons tightly, staring at the surroundings. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 5. Annihilation, 2. All of this was no longer justifiable by common spells. A banshee scream would have left bodies behind, while disjunction would have affected the clothes as well. Either would leave grayish-white dust behind as well, something that was quite difficult to clear. Even a legendary spell like Vampire's Embrace would leave its victims as dry, nearly mummified corpses. Flozan walked towards the Lighthouse of Time, touching the patterns carved onto the tower's body. She extended her senses carefully for a moment, before saying, "All of the power of time is gone, and with my current level of power it's impossible to restore. The flames of time are extinguished as well. They were crucial, containing Norland's coordinates. Without them, we can't return to Norland for now. Those in Norland won't be able to track our location either." "We're lost?" Ola exclaimed. If they were lost in the streams of time, death was their only fate. "It's not that serious, you sissy. We've at least come to a plain, and are all gathered together." Gangder bellowed. Gangder was right, but the circumstances were not optimistic either. Losing the coordinates of their plane meant that they did not know how long they had to stay on this foreign plane. This was no different from being sent into exile. The only silver lining was that the terrain and lifeforms were quite similar to Norland's own. It would be relatively easy to gather resources for their survival. Had they been thrown into an elemental plane, or someplace like the Abyss or Hell, they would have trouble even surviving. It also seemed like the base had a complete set of basic supplies, including enough weapons and armor to equip hundreds of men alongside months of rations. Tiramisu's voice suddenly sounded from the tavern. "This steak is a little strange. It looks delicious, but it's as if it was here for a few hundred years. I wouldn't dare eat it." "Then give it to me, I'm starving." "I can tell it's grilled to perfection." Medium rare bellowed. "Let's just bring it to that young lady Flozan, and have her take a look first." "Something's odd about this," Tiramisu insisted. The quarreling trolls squeezed their way out of the tavern. The thick flesh on their large bodies strained against the door a few times before they were able to pass through. Gods know how they entered before. Tiramisu carried a whole steak of lamb over. It seemed like it was just taken off the pan, and medium rare size were fixed on it as he constantly swallowed saliva. He really could be called a master of etiquette for a troll, able to restrain himself from drooling even when he was hungry. Flozan's slim figure seemed delicate as a reed in the wind in front of the two trolls who were more than 2.5 meters tall. However, the trolls were extremely respectful to her, second only to Richard himself. Tiramisu squatted down on the ground, bending over with much difficulty to present the steak so Flozan could check more easily. She gently chanted the spell, the first time she'd ever done so aloud in front of Richard. A ray of golden light was produced from her fingertips, transforming into grains of sand that landed on the steak. The surface shone with a golden radiance immediately, the intensity varying depending on the part of the meat. Some of the areas were completely dim, while on others it was so strong that these grains directly solidified into sands of time. Even then they couldn't hold the energy in, eventually charging towards the sky in a golden fountain. Flozan had a grave look on her face. She ordered Tiramisu to place the lamb steak on the floor. "There's some disordered remnants of the power of time on this. It was likely eroded in the streams of time, but I'm not sure why it's still intact. Some of the parts are new, while others are thousands of years old. If anyone eats this steak, some of their internals will likely age and degrade 1,000 years instantly. You should know the outcome of that." Tiramisu immediately broke out in a sweat. He looked at his own hands, and finding that they weren't showing any strange signs, he let out a breath of relief. On the other hand, Rare's legs had given in as he collapsed to the floor. It had never occurred to him that such a delicious steak could contain hidden dangers as well. Richard had been watching quietly from the side all this while, only speaking after Flozan stated her conclusion. "Don't you think this is strange? There are many abnormalities at the base. Those soldiers who ambushed us earlier were around level 4 or 5, which was not bad even for Norland's standards. Knight Kojo himself was a level 12 warrior. If this was really a low-level plane, how could a robust level 12 warrior only lead less than 100 soldiers over to battle?" Flozan raised her head, waiting for Richard to continue. Richard went on calmly, "If I'm not mistaken, we are currently in a secondary plane. The greatest powers here might already have reached legendary might if we guess based on Kojo's power. This surely isn't our original destination." Flozan said indifferently, "I don't know what has happened, but we clearly deviated from our target destination during the teleportation. The reconnaissance base that originally linked to us was shifted here, so we were led here as well. Without the proper defenses, the base did not manage to survive the shift, so all life forms disappeared. That matches with the current situation. Everyone in the base ought to have disappeared when it was displaced. That is why there's armor strewn everywhere, with half-cooked food and half-eaten steak. It explains everything we've seen." "Why?" Richard creased his brows. They had stable coordinates, and he was accompanied by a cleric of the Eternal Dragon itself. How could something like this still happen? "Anything can happen in the myriad planes," Flozan replied. This was an answer based on common sense, But in this situation, it was an answer of extreme helplessness as well. Flozen thought for a while. Someone could deliberately have disrupted the streams of time. From what I know, the eternal dragon's blessings have some hidden rules to them. A certain type of offering can be exchanged in turn for a certain type of blessing, and some ancient families have the methods to choose what they get. Although doing so will give them a weakened blessing, they might deem that appropriate under special circumstances. Richard, you have to consider whether there are people who would pay such a heavy price just to kill you. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 6. Annihilation, 3. Richard's brows furrowed as he thought back to the Joseph's assassination attempt. However, he was barely 16 years of age. Who would pay such a huge price to kill him? But it wasn't the time to ponder about such matters. I heard that the natives of a plane will treat us as enemies when we first enter it. Flozen nodded. Large-scale teleportation like our parties will definitely alert the experts who've grasped the laws of the plane. If this plane is as strong as you claim, then it will house at least a few legendary experts. We're now in an extremely dire situation. What do you plan to do? What to do? Richard inwardly flashed a wry smile. No matter how much they struggled, if the experts of this plane arrived here, they would have no chance of survival. Flozen, Gangder, Waterflower, the trolls, Ola. Everyone was looking intently at him, waiting for him to come to a decision. Richard was suddenly alarmed, reminded once again that he was the leader of this party. Even without his sheer power, he would have to make the decisions. The strength of their party, alongside the scouts already sent out, should have ensured that things wouldn't be too rough. However, the destination had been changed to an intermediate plane, so their priority was now mere survival. Richard looked at Flozen, asking the critical question, "There's no chance of going back, is there?" There are 3 methods if you wish to go back. First, conquer the entire plane. That will give me the resources to build a tower that can search for the coordinates of the eternal dragon. Second, if we're lucky enough, we might be able to find some ruins of the eternal dragon here. We can activate the church once more, performing a sacrifice for the blessings to reopen the tunnel to Norland. Third is for us to capture another party coming to this plane. Flozen spoke indifferently. As a priestess of the eternal dragon, she was naturally familiar with such matters. Richard surveyed the area again, before he spoke loudly. I really want to have luck like that, to be able to find the vestige of a church and then return to Norland. But even if we found a church, where are we going to obtain the items to sacrifice? Will obtaining the items to sacrifice to the eternal dragon easier than actually conquering the lands here? The item that sent us here was the head of a greater devil. We're already here. As an Archaron, I don't want to run back home with my head bowed down. I would rather choose the first option. In fact, that is our only choice. Richard's voice resounded in the camp. Archaron. Just that word seemed to have some strange effect on the party. Everyone's pulse quickened, their hearts coming to life in trepidation as they thirsted for fire and blood. And Richard was the leader of that zeal. Gangder roared at that moment, "Hey boss! Your martial arts were extremely dashing when you fought, but if you want to lift our fighting spirits, you need to drink wine. That'll give you the atmosphere." Richard stared at Gangder blankly. "You aren't nervous?" Gangder shrugged his shoulders. "I was a little afraid at first, but now that I think about it, the death camp was much more dangerous. Every creature there wanted your life. Since that last Waterflower isn't afraid, why should I be?" Waterflower had her sword hugged close, leaning against the wall. Her eyelids were half closed, as if she was about to sleep. It was as if she did not hear Gangder's provocation at all. It seemed like the current circumstances didn't matter to her much at all. With her white robes and bared legs, it made for a striking scene. Richard looked at the 2 trolls. Medium Rare scratched his head, saying slowly, "I'm just afraid that there will be nothing tasty to eat." Tiramisu raised its fist and smashed it against medium rare's skull. All you know is eating. It'll be perfect if there's trolls in this plane. We can infiltrate their camps. The 10 most beautiful ones are mine. You can start from the 11th. Medium rare jumped and howled, no way. You get the best one, that's it. I'm a mage. So what? The two trolls were going at each other's throats by then, so Richard turned to Ola. The bard's face was still ashen, he hadn't completely recovered yet. Perhaps it was the blood loss due to the injury, or maybe he was just afraid, but he shot a weak smile when he met Richard's gaze. However, he hesitated a bit before looking at Flozan. He mustered up his courage. If the beautiful Miss Flozan could give me some encouragement, perhaps a sweet kiss, I'll be filled with courage. Flozan smiled gently, you're teasing a priestess of the eternal dragon. Aren't you afraid of losing lifespan? Ola was stumped, not daring to press on. He turned elsewhere for his courage, this time to Waterflower. If this beautiful lady can give me some encouragement, I'll be bold enough to conquer the whole plane. Waterflower's brows twitched as she opened an eye. She stared at the elven bard and said indifferently, when the environment is better, but... Ola's face suddenly flushed red. He opened his arms out to the skies, as if wanting to embrace something. He then turned to Richard, getting on one knee before proclaiming, "You have the most courageous warrior, my lord." Richard did not know what to say. He could vaguely sense the girl's thoughts through their connection, and she didn't try to hide her feelings. While she had spoken the truth, it was only technically so. This scene was filled with many chops and slices, but it didn't seem appropriate to tell the elven romantic the truth. It was only then that Richard realized it would not be easy to lead a party. He could not fathom how Gatton had managed to amass 13 knights under his banner. From Mordred to Lena, they all had their own quirks. And each of them were not to be trifled with, and were not saints. And now, Gangder propped his chin with his hands and looked at Ola like one would at a fool. He had wanted to laugh, because he felt like there was a sense of accomplishment looking at somebody acting like this. The Baron's troops may appear shortly. Flozan interjected. Richard inhaled deeply, we can deal with the Baron. I have to hurry and try to understand the seed. Indeed, the seed, that azure gray egg, was the only resource they hadn't used. Seed, Flozan's body shuddered. Richard looked at her, but he could only see her head bowed down with a blank expression. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc. Please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 7. Seed. Everyone was aware that the fight just then was only a beginning. Endless battles would ensue, and they would be the enemies of all the inhabitants of the plane. Thus, they all went their separate ways once the situation was clarified for now, busying themselves almost as if they were puppets powered by magic crystals. Flozan began conducting checks all over the base. The Lighthouse of Time was a magical building, blessed with the supreme power of the eternal dragon itself. Although the entirety of the building could be seen on this plane, a part of it was actually connected to a rift in the void. This rift was what allowed it to guide travelers, but even with the flames extinguished, this meant the magic arrays still connected this base to the rift. Extra precaution had to be taken, lest a crack in the void tearing the place apart, or worse, swallowing it whole. Besides, traces of turbulent time flows were still scattered in various corners of the base. This was fatal to a commoner, but as a cleric of the eternal dragon, Flozan could use this power to replenish her own, or even gradually strengthen her mana. She measured it silently in her heart. If she could clear out the power of time from the entire base, she would be able to advance to level 9. Even if she still wouldn't be able to cast grade 5 spells, her energy pool would increase to an extent. It could count as having profited off a disaster. On the other hand, the knights grew busy packing up the mess of weapons and armor that Flozan had already sorted out. These supplies were extremely useful, with the better equipment besting even what they'd brought along on the trip. A lot of the supplies on their trip had been magic resources. After all, their leader was a rune master. The weapons and armor they could prepare paled in comparison. As they packed everything up, they also buried their dead comrades right next to the base. If the day came when they could return home, they would take their ashes along back to Norland. Otherwise, they would end up fertilizing the same earth. The enemies were buried or cremated as well. Norland's code of chivalry espoused respect for deceased enemies, and any mishandling of opponent corpses was considered disgraceful and dishonorable. However, all weapons, armor, and personal belongings left behind by the deceased enemies were considered spoils of war, and would be recovered carefully. On the other side, Waterflower and Gangder were exploring the surrounding terrain. Ola had initially wanted to tag along with Waterflower, but for some unknown reason decided to stay behind in the end. As Gangder left, he looked back at the elf with regret. Of course, the bard didn't stay behind for nothing. Richard immediately assigned him to interrogating the surviving captives for more intel. Sir Kojo was merely a sentry, and had a baron backing him up. Who, then, was backing up the baron? The two trolls ran outside the base, plopping down at a random spot to nap. With their natural vitality, they could recover with mere food and sleep. The two arrows that nearly killed Ola would only be minor injuries to them, ones that would heal in a couple of days. Flozen had completed a rough check of the base by the time dusk fell. Thankfully, she didn't find any rifts in spacetime. As soon as the power of time was cleared out, the base could be put to use once again. The provisions, weapons, arrows, and other supplies stocked within were an immediate solution to Richard's desperate situation, with enough to equip hundreds of soldiers. Seeing that everything in the base was in good order, Richard left on his own. He found an empty plot of land, preparing to try and plant the seed. The area he chose was on high ground, within sight of the base. He would be able to rush over immediately if there was a problem. At that moment, Richard had the seed in his hands. The azure eggshell trembled continuously, almost as if there was a little life inside waiting to burst through at any moment. Richard believed that the seed was a special life form. Its life force was growing increasingly powerful, almost as if it had absorbed some power when they were crossing planes. The closer he held it to himself, the stronger the pulse of the being within grew. What could possibly be in this egg? A frightening biological weapon? A magical beast? Something that could cause even High Priestess Ferlin to lose a great deal of her blessing to reveal little information about was likely much stronger than a mere lesser dragon. The eggshell was like an impregnable fort, standing strong in the face of the strikes of the life within. With the egg in hand, Richard was at a loss for what to do. The seed didn't respond at all to his mana. It was when he tried to project a strand of his consciousness in an attempt to look within that something changed. Richard's consciousness was pulled in, flooding frantically into the seed. An excruciating pain hit him, and he felt as though his head was about to split apart. His very soul felt like it was being torn apart with great strength. If not for his tenacity and willpower, he would have fainted then and there. However, the flow of his consciousness continued on uninterrupted, with no way to stop in sight. Richard was well aware that a failure to stop this would lead to his soul itself being drawn out. However, the pull from the seed was so large that none of his attempts worked. The acute pain tormented him, leaving him paralyzed and unable to move. He couldn't utter a single word, or even throw the seed away. Although Richard's consciousness was far stronger than those of his peers, he did not have infinite power. All of his strength was exhausted in the blink of an eye, the tremendous force then pulling his soul itself towards the shell. At this moment, brilliant rays of light erupted from several magic symbols in his sea of consciousness, the imprints of his soul contract and slave contracts. Formidable power suddenly grabbed firmly onto Richard's drifting soul, going head-on against the force of the seed. Crack! Richard felt something snap deep in his consciousness. His soul was torn apart by the two great powers, a small bit of it sucked in by the seed with force. His vision blacked out, before he collapsed onto the floor. His taut nerves had relaxed in a flash. At the same time, Waterflower, who's been prancing around in the trees, suddenly fell headfirst to the ground. She had lost consciousness. In yet another direction, a running gangster abruptly clutched his head, yelling in pain. His mind was sent into chaos, rendering him unable to distinguish directions as he ran into a large tree. A loud snap sounded, and this tree that was more than 10 feet in diameter actually broke in half as gangster crashed into it. Outside the base, the two sleeping trolls awoke with a start. They bolted up at the same time, clutching their heads as they howled in anguish. In the base itself, a certain elven bard spouted a mouthful of blood and fainted at a crucial moment in his interrogation. Not long after he lost consciousness, Richard was awakened by the feeling of a pinprick. Barely able to raise his head, he saw the seed that was stuck to his cheek fall in front of his eyes. His vision was filled with azure blue, glossy and gentle. It lacked the pores that were present on normal eggs. An indistinct mind suddenly transmitted a message from within the seedling, a faint voice ringing at the bottom of Richard's heart: blood. Blood. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 8. Seed. Having absorbed a piece of Richard's soul, the larva in the egg had built a spiritual connection with Richard, just like the one he shared with Waterflower. It hadn't cracked its shell open yet, but it was already asking for Richard's blood. Its calls were quite feeble, almost as though they were about to fade away. However, that thirst was exceptionally distinct. Richard lost himself in a trance for a moment, not catching on until he felt some warmth from his face. He wiped with his hand, finding his palm covered in red. It was only then that Richard found his mouth was reeking of blood as well. This was probably due to injuries inflicted to his organs when he was trying to withstand the severe pain of having his soul torn apart. Blood was also flowing out of his nose and the corners of his eyes, which was why it covered his face. Blood, the seed was still calling out. This was no known language, instead a fluctuation that bombarded his very soul with the request. He decided to simply smear the blood on his hands onto that flawlessly smooth and shiny eggshell. The moment he did so, all of the blood was consumed. Richard could tell in his mind that the life within the egg was beginning to grow rapidly, ever changing as its presence grew stronger and stronger. By the end, even he himself had to shudder. The seed asked for no more blood. That single drop was akin to a spark, igniting the fires of its life. A soft click rang out, and a visible crack appeared on the eggshell, soon followed by many more. A sharp blade of darkness eventually made its way out, signifying that the egg had hatched. The seed had sprouted. The eggshell shattered with that blade as the center, pieces falling to the ground as what seemed like a black insect crawled out from within. This creature had 6 limbs like an arthropod, with an exceptionally large abdomen. 2 sharp blades were attached to the area near its head, making it look like a comical little ball with a few blades stuck on it. The creature dived for the remainder of the eggshell the moment it made its way out, chewing it all up in the blink of an eye. It cleared the fragments out thoroughly, leaving nothing behind at all. It was like a vacuum had sucked everything on the ground away. Another thing the creature did was cleaning up Richard's bloodstains. It was unknown how exactly it managed to absorb all the blood, but the grass had lost all remains of his blood. The creature then forced itself up, its entire body trembling rapidly as the sticky fluid on its surface was rapidly absorbed within. Its shell gradually grew hard, beginning to sparkle even as its body grew at a visible pace. Clearing the remnants of the eggshell on the ground, it lifted up its torso with all its might, looking at Richard with 6 pairs of eyes. The complex organ that it had for a mouth began to open and close rapidly. Numerous unintelligible syllables rang out in Richard's consciousness, incessant, rapid, and chaotic. It took a while for them to transform into a clear, albeit peculiar, voice, the voice of this newborn creature. It had just been looking for a way to communicate with Richard, and it had identified that to be Norland's common tongue instead of the spiritual wave it had used before. Need. High energy. Food. The creature struggled to express itself. You are the seed? Richard probed. Seed. Hibernation. For when we travel. It still couldn't formulate a proper sentence. We? What are you? Richard asked. The voice grew unclear once more when Richard asked that question, growing comprehensible again with great difficulty. We. I'm not sure. I don't know what we are. Memory only goes back to birth. Everything before is blank. I am a brood mother, exist to exterminate enemies. Who are your enemies then? Richard asked warily. This little creature had just been born, but it was already giving off an aura that made him shudder. Its enemies would definitely be even harder to deal with. Your enemies are my enemies, master. This time, the reply was fluent and clear. You call me your master? Yes, you brought me to life. Only my predetermined master can bring me to life. I will follow orders. Richard squatted down, looking at this little creature that seemed to be a bizarre insect. Brood mother. What kind of food do you survive on? Blood, flesh, all kinds of life, energy crystals, it answered with some difficulty, making the problem of vocabulary obvious. I'm still in my first stage, larva. I can scavenge for food on my own. I still need to learn your language, master. That will require a day. Richard was a little speechless. Even grand mages with the assistance of language proficiency spells would need at least half a month to master a language fully. Even basic communication needed 3 days, but this newborn was saying it would need just one. I'll go get you something to eat, there are still some food reserves left in the base. You were just born, and might meet with danger outside. No, I can feel it. Over here. I don't have any predators. The brood mother then opened up the shell on its back, revealing small wings. It flapped them hard, getting its body airborne until it was level with Richard's eyes. It then flew into the jungle, slow and clumsy. All of a sudden, Richard was startled. Precision told him that this creature was already half a fold larger than when it was just born, the increased size equivalent to the mass of the eggshell it had ingested. This was near lossless absorption of food, a terrifying prospect. Subconsciously, Richard felt an indescribable fear towards this creature he had never heard of before. There were no magic records accounting for its presence, and while it looked like a beautiful shiny insect right now, it chilled him down to the spine. Richard could remember several life forms even more peculiar than the brood mother. Even the subterra of Norland had creatures like soul-sucking devils and driders, as well as the people of the sea. However, no matter how hideous and horrifying these races were, or how destructive or eerie their powers could get, there was normally a lot of recorded information about them. They were formidable, yes, but not frightening. Only the unknown frightens man. Richard could tell the brood mother's rough position through their soul connection, just like he could with Waterflower. He was even able to touch upon its mind, a lifeless icy world devoid of emotion. The truly frightening part was the appalling focus of its thoughts. At this moment, the entirety of its being was devoted to its search for food. That was its one directive, to consume food rapidly so it could grow past its larval stage. The brood mother's functions? Richard received information that it would be shown to him once it was finished with the task. At that moment, Flozen ran over with 2 knights alongside her. She only let out a sigh of relief once she saw him safe and well in the distance, probing, "What happened? Are you all right?" "I just succeeded in planting the seed. It contained a brood mother, and the creature is already off scavenging for food." "Do you know anything about these things?" Richard looked unsettled. He described the creature's appearance in detail, but Flozen said she hadn't seen nor heard of such a thing before. However, this was not the first time that the Eternal Dragon had blessed someone with the unknown. These discoveries enhanced their own records. Since the brood mother had already formed a connection with his soul, she said there wasn't much cause for worry. With it being a contract creature bestowed by the eternal dragon itself, there would certainly be no problem. If you find any errors, ads pop up, ads redirect, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know. Report chapter so we can fix it as soon as possible. Book 2, Chapter 9. Message. A moment later, Richard returned to the base alongside Flozan. He'd already understood the situation, having sorted out his priorities. The first and foremost task was to gather information, both about the incoming Baron and their environment. Next was to boost everyone's morale, and finally was the problem of forming an army in this plane. Everyone contracted to Richard rushed back to the base as well, making sure that he was safe. Richard reassigned their roles, sending Ola out alongside Gangder and Waterflower to inspect the terrain. The trolls, now awake, would help the knights clean up the battlefield and repair equipment. Tiramisu would get to showcase his skills, transcribing a large number of language proficiency scrolls. The first step to root themselves in this plane would be conquering the language barrier. With Ola's progress on the interrogation being lackluster, Richard decided to interrogate the captives himself. Flozan would assist him, keeping them from dying if he lost control. Ola had already found out some information, but he was so gentle that he was slowed down at key points. They gave him illogical, contradicting statements on the number of soldiers and knights the Baron had, and even their original follow-up plan as well as the relief of the Baron's territory. With the intense sense of crisis enveloping his heart, Richard had already lost his patience. Every passing hour at that point signified growing danger. Perhaps the Baron's army was already on its way, or the deities had sent out a new order through their oracles. How could he afford to let these captives waste any more of his precious time? Richard was still in a daze as he walked into the small but well-equipped interrogation room. The two captives originally felt like they could bear more punishment, but they shriveled with cold as he walked into the room. The very light in the place seemed to have dimmed. The duo were covered with injuries, but none of them were serious. They both looked to be in their 30s, of strong build and seemingly of decent skill as well. Level 5 warriors as they were, their sharp gazes indicated that they were determined to just survive whatever they were put through. They were likely veterans. With just one look, Richard realized that this would be relatively difficult to handle, but there were no solutions for that. Two kinds of people could not be defeated by torture, ones with strong faith, and those who would protect something no matter what.